Section 1. The yellow skin. Nobody ever explained. Close your eyes for a moment, or leave them open, whichever feels right. Let the room around you go a little soft at the edges. We're going somewhere familiar tonight. Somewhere you've probably visited hundreds of times without ever truly stopping to look at it. A neighborhood in a town called Springfield, where the lawns are slightly too green, the sky is a shade of blue that doesn't quite exist in nature, and every single person you have ever met there, every face you have ever recognized, shares the exact same skin tone, a shade of yellow that doesn't appear anywhere else in the world. Not in any other animated show, not in any other fictional universe, not on any human being who has ever lived. And nobody in that town has ever asked why. Get comfortable, pull your blanket up a little. This is going to take a while, and there's no rush. The theories we're walking through tonight aren't the loud, dramatic ones. They're the quiet ones. The ones that get under your skin slowly, the way a dream does, revealing their shape only after you've been inside them for a while. Let's start with the yellow. It seems like such an obvious thing. The Simpsons are yellow. Springfield is full of yellow people. Everyone accepts this. Most people, when pressed, will say something along the lines of, well, that's just the art style. Matt Groening chose yellow for his characters because it would grab the attention of viewers flipping channels. The yellow skin pops on a television screen. It's a design decision, nothing more and nothing less. And that explanation is, in fact, the real one. Groening has confirmed it. The color choice was practical and deliberate, and motivated entirely by visual distinctiveness. But here's the thing about The Simpsons that makes it unlike almost any other television show in history. The show doesn't just depict a world. Over 36 years and nearly 800 episodes, it has built a world with enough internal logic, enough recurring rules and consistent patterns, that it invites you to treat it as real. It invites analysis. It rewards close attention. And when you pay close enough attention, the official explanations start to feel insufficient. The yellow skin, viewed through the logic of Springfield's own universe, is deeply strange. Let's establish what we know. Every Springfield resident shares the same coloring. Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, Maggie, the neighbors and the co-workers and the barflies and the schoolchildren. Mayor Quimby and Chief Wiggum and Principal Skinner and Apu and Sideshow Bob. Yellow, all of them yellow. The same yellow, universally consistent across every corner of the town, every socioeconomic class, every age group, every generation, and then a guest character arrives. A celebrity, a visiting relative from out of town, a federal agent passing through, and they look different. Not just slightly different in the way that supporting characters sometimes look different from main characters in an animated show. Fundamentally different. More proportionally correct. Eyes that sit at a more natural position on the face. Skin that is not yellow, or at least not quite the same yellow, rendered in a way that reads more closely as a representation of an actual human being. The show has always treated this as a simple, artistic convention. Main characters and long-term Springfield residents are drawn in one style. Outsiders and guests are drawn more realistically. There is nothing mysterious about this, the writers would tell you. It's just the visual grammar of the show. Except within the logic of Springfield's own universe, that distinction carries an implication the show never addresses out loud. The people who live in Springfield look one way. The people who visit from outside look another way. And the difference is visible, consistent, and systematic. If you were a scientist studying this phenomenon from within the show's reality, you would have to conclude that something about living in Springfield, over time, produces observable physical changes in the human body. Something that affects pigmentation. Something that alters proportion and structure in ways that are uniform across the entire population, regardless of genetics or family history. Now, this is the point where the radiation theory usually enters the conversation. And we'll get to radiation in a moment, because it is absolutely relevant. But the yellow skin specifically points to something the radiation theory alone doesn't fully address. Radiation exposure doesn't turn people yellow. Radiation exposure produces a range of biological effects, and some of them can alter skin tone, but not in this uniform, population-wide, perfectly consistent way. What the yellow skin most closely resembles in medical terms is jaundice. Jaundice is a condition in which the skin and whites of the eyes take on a yellowish color due to an excess of bilirubin in the bloodstream. Bilirubin is a yellow compound that forms when red blood cells break down. The liver is responsible for processing bilirubin and removing it from the body. When the liver is functioning correctly, bilirubin is cleared efficiently, and the skin remains its normal color. When the liver is damaged, or when something is overwhelming the liver's capacity to process bilirubin, the compound accumulates in the bloodstream, and the skin turns yellow. Jaundice is a symptom. It's not a disease in itself. It's a signal from the body that something is wrong with the liver, or with the blood, or with the bile ducts. In adults, jaundice typically indicates liver disease, bile duct obstruction, hepatitis, or in some cases, chronic exposure to certain toxins. Every person in Springfield has yellow skin. Every single one of them. If you interpret that yellowness not as an art style, but as a physical characteristic within the show's universe, then every person in Springfield is exhibiting the same symptom simultaneously. A symptom that, in the real world, indicates hepatic stress or liver damage. And Springfield has a nuclear power plant that has been leaking radioactive material into the water supply, the soil, and the air for decades. Certain radioactive isotopes are hepatotoxic. They damage liver tissue. They impair the liver's ability to perform its basic filtering functions. Long-term, low-level exposure to certain forms of radiation can produce chronic liver damage that manifests, among other ways, as persistent jaundice. The show never says this. The show never draws this connection. Homer has never sat down at a doctor's desk and been told that the yellow color of his skin is a sign of hepatic dysfunction caused by decades of working in proximity to an improperly maintained nuclear reactor. The show treats the yellow skin as what it is in the real world, which is an artistic choice, and asks you to do the same. But the detail is there. It has always been there. Baked into the visual design of every character, in every episode, across every season. Every face in Springfield is quietly, persistently, permanently symptomatic. There's another dimension to this that goes beyond biology. The yellow skin also functions as a marker of identity within Springfield's social universe. When you can look at a character and immediately determine whether they're a Springfield local or an outsider based on their skin tone, the show is doing something more sophisticated than simple visual shorthand. It's drawing a boundary. Springfield residents are one kind of thing. Everyone else is another. And the border between those two categories is written on the body. This connects to something that the show explores throughout its run without ever fully articulating. Springfield is an isolated community. Not physically isolated, the town has highways and an airport and rail connections, but socially and culturally isolated in the way that small insular communities tend to be. Springfield's residents are people who, for the most part, were born there and have remained there. The town has its own rhythms and its own logic and its own set of unspoken rules about how things work and who belongs and what is acceptable to question. Outsiders are recognized immediately in Springfield, not just because they look different, though they do, but because they behave differently. They ask questions that locals have stopped asking. They find things strange that locals have normalized. They are, in the language of anthropology, culturally legible in a way that marks them as foreign to the community's particular shared reality. The yellow skin in this reading is Springfield's brand. It's the mark that the town leaves on the people who stay long enough. An involuntary tattoo written in jaundice that identifies you as a permanent resident of this particular place with all of its particular toxins and traditions and willful blindnesses. And the truly eerie part is this: the characters don't know they're yellow. There is not a single episode in the show's 36-year run in which a Springfield resident looks in the mirror and notices their own skin color and finds it remarkable. They have no awareness of the thing that makes them visually distinctive. The symptom is invisible to the people carrying it. This is not, if you think about it carefully, a particularly unusual feature of chronic illness. People who live with long-term, slowly progressing conditions often have great difficulty perceiving their own deterioration. The change happens so gradually, so incrementally, that there is never a single moment in which things were clearly different. The liver damage doesn't happen overnight. The jaundice doesn't arrive in a dramatic rush. It seeps in over years and decades, and by the time it's become the defining characteristic of your appearance, it's simply how you look. It's simply how everyone looks. It's simply how things are. Springfield normalizes itself continuously and completely. This is perhaps the town's most consistent characteristic across all 800 episodes. The impossible becomes routine. The alarming becomes background noise. The symptom becomes the baseline. There is one episode that edges closer to this territory than almost any other, though it never quite arrives at an explicit conclusion. In the Season 7 episode, Radioactive Man, the town of Springfield is visited by a Hollywood film crew coming to produce a major superhero movie. The production brings dozens of outsiders into Springfield, actors and crew members and executives who have come from outside the town, who interact with Springfield's residents as an audience observes a spectacle. And throughout the episode, the outsiders find Springfield deeply strange. They're not sure how to articulate what bothers them about the place. The town's behavior is odd. The people's reactions are off. The social dynamics are difficult to parse. The entire community feels, to the visitors, like a place operating according to rules that nobody has explained. The episode plays this for comedy. The Hollywood types are fish out of water in a quirky small town. The locals are bewildered by the glamour and excess of the film industry. It's a culture clash episode, but underneath the comedy, there's something worth paying attention to. The outsiders can see that something is wrong in Springfield. They can't name it. They can't diagnose it, but they can feel it. The town has a texture that doesn't match the world they came from. And the moment the production relocates, the moment the outsiders leave, Springfield returns to its baseline state. The brief intrusion of an external perspective closes like a wound. This is, in miniature, the yellow skin problem writ large. Outside eyes can see Springfield's strangeness. Inside eyes cannot. And because the people with inside eyes are the ones who never leave, the strangeness persists, unexamined, season after season, episode after episode. Maggie's eyes are yellow adjacent in a way that's worth dwelling on for a moment. The baby of the Simpson family, the one who never speaks and never grows and never changes, has enormous dark eyes that take up an improbable proportion of her face. Her eyes are, in many ways, the most expressive feature in the entire show. More expressive than Homer's small startled circles. More expressive than Marge's wide and often worried ovals. Maggie's eyes are the eyes of someone watching. Always watching. Taking in information and cataloging it and holding it behind that placid baby face that reveals nothing. The yellow skin she shares with every other resident is, on Maggie, somehow more noticeable precisely because of those enormous watching eyes. She looks like a creature adapted for low-light observation, a being whose visual system has been optimized for taking in as much information as possible from the environment. And the environment she's been watching, from the day she was born, is Springfield, a town full of yellow people who don't know they're yellow. A town whose signature biological marker is invisible to the people who carry it. A town that has been slowly, quietly, persistently altering the bodies of everyone who lives there, and has been doing so for so long that the alteration has become the definition of normal. There's a companion mystery to the yellow skin that doesn't get nearly enough attention: the 4 fingers. Every character in The Simpsons, with one notable exception we'll get to in a moment, has 4 fingers on each hand. 4 fingers and a thumb, which gives each hand 4 visible digits rather than the human standard of 5. This is common in animation. Animating 5 fingers is more labor-intensive than animating 4, and the visual simplification has been standard in animated cartoons since the early days of the medium. Mickey Mouse has 4 fingers. Bugs Bunny has 4 fingers. It's an economy of design. But again, within Springfield's universe, the 4 fingers are a physical characteristic. They're not a simplification that the characters themselves experience as a simplification. The characters have 4 fingers. That is, the number of fingers they have. And this is universal across the Springfield population in exactly the same way the yellow skin is universal. Except for one character, God. When God appears in The Simpsons, which happens more than once across the show's run, God has 5 fingers. God is the only being in the show's universe who possesses a standard human hand configuration. Every Springfield resident, every being who exists within the contaminated, isolated, impossible reality of the town has 4 fingers. The divine being who exists outside of that reality has 5. This could be a completely intentional artistic choice, a way of visually distinguishing the divine from the mortal within the show's universe, and it probably is. But it's also a detail that rewards the reading that Springfield's physical characteristics, including the number of fingers its residents possess, are the product of something that happened to the town's population, rather than simply being how human beings look in this universe. Because the being who exists outside Springfield's influence looks different. Structurally different, more complete, If Springfield's residents are experiencing biological changes caused by long-term exposure to environmental toxins, and if those changes include something that affects development at the cellular level, something that could theoretically alter the expression of genes responsible for limb development, then the four fingers become, in the same way the yellow skin becomes, a population-wide physical marker of an environmental effect. It's worth pausing here and acknowledging something that the show does, quietly and consistently, that makes all of this more unsettling rather than less. The show knows, at some level, in some corner of the writer's room across 36 years of production, someone has always known that these details accumulate into something that looks less like a cartoon and more like a case file. The show makes jokes about the yellow skin. It makes jokes about the four fingers. There are meta moments where characters almost acknowledge the strangeness of their own appearance, and then the joke ends and the episode continues and nothing changes. The humor functions as a pressure valve. It releases just enough acknowledgement to prevent the accumulated evidence from becoming impossible to ignore, and then it seals the valve again before anyone can follow the implications to their logical conclusion. Springfield's self-defense mechanism isn't just collective denial, though that's certainly part of it. It's also comedy. The town uses laughter to prevent investigation. Every time a detail about yellow skin or four fingers or three-eyed fish comes close to being examined seriously, a joke arrives to neutralize it. The viewer laughs, the tension releases, the episode moves on, and the yellow people keep living their yellow lives in their yellow town, unaware of what they look like to anyone paying close enough attention. The last thing worth noting about the yellow skin, before we move deeper into Springfield's hidden architecture, is what it means for the viewer. For 36 years, hundreds of millions of people around the world have watched The Simpsons and normalized yellow skin without thinking about it. Children who grew up with the show absorbed the visual grammar of Springfield so completely that the yellow faces read not as strange but as familiar, comforting even. The color of home. This is, in a quiet way, the show's most extraordinary achievement. It made the symptom into the symbol of safety. It made the marker of a damaged population into the most recognizable and beloved visual shorthand in the history of television. We look at Springfield and we feel at home. We recognize those yellow faces. We trust them, we love them. And the faces look back at us, four-fingered and jaundiced and completely unaware of what they are. There's one more dimension to the yellow skin theory that almost nobody talks about, and it concerns the children. Specifically, the fact that Bart, Lisa, and Maggie were all born yellow. They didn't arrive in Springfield from somewhere else and gradually take on the town's coloring. They emerged from a Springfield household, from Springfield-born parents, having been formed entirely within Springfield's environment, and they were yellow from birth. This is clinically significant if you're following the jaundice reading. Neonatal jaundice, jaundice in newborns, is actually extremely common and usually resolves within the first 2 weeks of life as the infant's liver matures and begins processing bilirubin efficiently. But persistent neonatal jaundice, jaundice that doesn't resolve, that maintains itself through the infant's development and into childhood and adolescence and adulthood, is a sign of something ongoing, something systemic, something that the body's developing liver cannot overcome because the underlying cause of the jaundice isn't going away. If the cause is environmental, if the water the infant consumes and the air the infant breathes continue delivering the hepatotoxic material that's preventing the liver from clearing bilirubin properly, then the neonatal jaundice doesn't resolve. It becomes childhood jaundice. And childhood jaundice, persisting, becomes the yellow skin of the adult Springfield resident. The condition isn't acquired in adulthood. It's inherited in the sense that the environment that produces it is inherited. Born into Springfield, born yellow. Raised in Springfield, stay yellow. The body never gets the chance to clear the symptom because the cause is continuous and omnipresent and embedded in every glass of water and every breath of air that the Springfield environment provides. This is why every Springfield-born character shares the same coloring, regardless of their parents' background or the town's demographic diversity. The shared environmental cause produces a shared symptom. The diversity of the population's genetic heritage is irrelevant because the jaundice isn't genetic. It's the town's response to what the town has been putting in the water. The show's writers, working in 1989 and drawing on the tradition of simplified animation design that stretches back through decades of cartoon history, almost certainly never intended any of this. The yellow skin is an art decision. The four fingers are a labor-saving convention. The guest character visual distinction is a storytelling tool for distinguishing familiar faces from new ones. But the show built a world around these choices. It built that world carefully and consistently, and with sufficient internal logic that the choices accumulated into something that rewards examination. And what the examination reveals, when you approach the show's visual language as if it were evidence rather than design, is the portrait of a population that has been living inside its own slow disaster for so long that the disaster has become indistinguishable from the landscape. The faces are yellow, the fingers are 4, the fish have 3 eyes, and the town wakes up every morning and gets on with it, as it has always gotten on with it, without asking the one question that would make all of it legible. Why are we all like this? Drop a comment below with the time and the place you're watching from, and if you want more breakdowns like this one, subscribe. There are a lot more theories where these came from, and we're just getting started. The yellow skin is also worth examining as a class marker within Springfield's own internal hierarchy. Burns is yellow. His doctors are yellow. The highest paid professionals in the town and the lowest paid laborers share the same skin tone because they share the same contaminated environment. The radiation doesn't respect income brackets. It doesn't filter itself according to the social status of the organism it affects. The 3-eyed fish doesn't appear only in the river behind the poor neighborhoods. The radiation moves through the water table without consulting anyone's W-2. This is, in a perverse way, one of Springfield's most egalitarian features. The contamination is universal. The symptom is shared. The billionaire and the safety inspector display the same jaundice because the same water flows through both their households. Burns has the resources to address some of what the radiation does to his biology. He has the weekly treatments. He has the private physicians, he has the pharmaceutical infrastructure and the money to access interventions that are unavailable to anyone else in town. But he can't change the color of his skin any more than Homer can, because the environmental cause is continuous and the jaundice is its continuous expression. There is something grimly democratic about this. Springfield's great class equalizer is the poison in its water supply. It makes everyone the same shade of yellow regardless of what they can afford, or who they know, or how many floors up their office is. Burns at the top of his tower and Apu behind the counter of the Quick E-Mart are equally, identically, permanently jaundiced. The contamination zone doesn't have a first-class section. This doesn't mitigate anything about Burns's responsibility for the contamination. The fact that the poison he's been allowing to leak into the water supply for decades has also been affecting his own biology doesn't make the contamination less of a crime. It makes it more interesting, philosophically, as an example of the way systems of extraction eventually consume their operators along with their victims. Burns built the machine. The machine does what machines do. It doesn't distinguish between the hand that built it and the hands that feed it. Yellow is the color of Springfield. It is the color of what happens when a community is left inside a contamination zone long enough for the contamination to become constitutional, to become part of what being a Springfield resident means at the cellular level. And the show put this color on every face and called it warmth, and it became warmth. And the warmth was real and the faces were symptomatic, and both of these things were always true simultaneously. The detail about 4 fingers and God's 5 fingers is the most theologically interesting visual choice the show makes, even if it was never intended as theology. In a universe where God has confirmed existence by appearing and speaking, the physical distinction between divine and mortal hands is not decorative. It carries weight. The God of the Simpsons has the hands that all hands were presumably supposed to have. Springfield's residents have the hands that resulted from what happened to Springfield. The divine template and the Springfield reality have diverged by exactly 1 finger per hand, and the divergence has been present long enough that no one in Springfield experiences it as divergence. It's simply the configuration of a hand. It's simply how hands are. The original design is visible only in something that exists outside the town's contamination zone, and the show placed it there quietly, in a detail almost no one notices, and left it for 36 years without comment. Number. Section 2. The Treehouse of Horror Continuity. What the Halloween episodes actually reveal. Every October, The Simpsons does something it has done since 1990. It steps outside its own rules. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are the show's annual Halloween specials, anthology format, 3 short stories per episode, no continuity, no consequences, characters die and come back, monsters are real, the laws of physics take a sabbatical. They're the episodes the writers use to go places the main canon can't go. to kill off beloved characters, to blow up the town, to let Homer commit genuinely horrifying acts without the audience needing to process them as part of the ongoing story? The official framing is simple. Treehouse of Horror episodes don't count. They're non-canon, they're dream sequences or alternate realities or stories being told around a campfire, and nothing that happens in them affects the main timeline. You're supposed to enjoy them as isolated horror comedy pieces, and then set them aside when November arrives and the show goes back to normal. But here's what nobody talks about. The Treehouse of Horror episodes, across 33 years of production, have accidentally constructed something. In their collective accumulation, in the patterns that repeat across them, in the details that recur and evolve and build on each other, they've assembled an alternate version of Springfield that is more honest about the town than the main canon ever allows itself to be. And the question worth asking isn't whether the Halloween episodes are real within the show's universe. The question is what they reveal about the real Springfield that the show can't say directly. Let's start with the obvious. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are the only space in the show where Springfield's residents die in significant numbers, not Hans Moleman background deaths. Actual, named, consequential deaths. Homer dies, Bart dies, Marge dies. The townspeople are consumed, vaporized, transformed, devoured. The show's normal rules about consequence-free recovery are suspended, and Springfield becomes what it perhaps always was beneath the comedy. A dangerous place where living things get destroyed. Every Treehouse of Horror episode in which the Springfield population is decimated is on some level an expression of an anxiety the main show has been suppressing. The main canon version of Springfield is maintained through a rigorous commitment to reset. After every catastrophe, things return to normal. But the Halloween specials don't have to honor that commitment. And in the absence of the reset imperative, what do the writers reach for? Death. Mass death. The destruction of the town and its people through forces that are, episode after episode, environmental or institutional or connected in some way to the power plant, the government, or the wealthy elite of Springfield. In the Treehouse of Horror episode Dial Z for Zombie, the dead rise from Springfield Cemetery and consume the living. In Homer 3, Homer is sucked into a three-dimensional realm, and the town is left to grapple with his absence. In The Homer of Seville, the show plays with Homer's vulnerability to forces he doesn't understand or control. The horror anthology format gives the writers permission to follow the implications of Springfield's premise to their darkest endpoints. And the darkest endpoint of Springfield's premise, stripped of comedy, is a town full of cognitively impaired, biologically compromised people being destroyed by forces they can't see and wouldn't recognize even if they could. The aliens are the detail most worth paying attention to across the Treehouse of Horror episodes. Kang and Kodos, the two recurring alien characters who appear in virtually every Halloween special, are in many ways the most consistent presence in the entire anthology series. They show up, they observe, they comment on humanity's foolishness, they occasionally attempt to conquer Springfield, and they always fail. Not because Springfield's residents resist effectively, but because the town's dysfunction thwarts the aliens' plans through pure incompetence and chaos. In the famous Citizen Kang episode, Kang and Kodos replace both presidential candidates before an election, disguising themselves as humans and manipulating the political process. They're eventually exposed, their disguises are torn away, and the citizens of Springfield, confronted with irrefutable proof that their political leaders are extraterrestrial imposters, shrug and vote for one of them anyway, because at that point, those are the only candidates on the ballot. The episode is one of the sharpest pieces of political satire the show ever produced. But it's also an expression of something the show has been building toward across every Treehouse of Horror episode in which Kang and Kodos appear. Springfield cannot be conquered by external forces because Springfield is already conquered. The aliens don't need to take over. The infrastructure of control is already in place. The population is already compliant. The only thing that changes when aliens take the place of human leaders is the species of the entity doing the exploitation. This is presented as comedy, a profoundly bleak observation about civic life. The show is saying that the specific identity of Springfield's ruling class is largely irrelevant to the experience of Springfield's residents. Power operates the same way regardless of who holds it. Compliance is produced by the same mechanisms. The population remains the same population. The aliens are interchangeable with the politicians, not because the aliens are harmless, but because the politicians were already alien to the people they governed. The Treehouse of Horror episodes also provide the show's only reliable access to Springfield's subconscious. In the main canon, characters' interior lives are carefully managed. Homer's emotional landscape is comically simple. Marge's anxieties are expressed through physical symptoms, her hair rising or falling or tightening in ways that signal distress without requiring direct articulation. Lisa's inner world is expressed primarily through music and isolated monologue. The characters' psychologies are present but compressed, available to the audience in glimpses rather than sustained examination. In the horror anthology episodes, the compression is released. The genre permits interiority. In Nightmare on Evergreen Terrace, groundskeeper Willie haunts the dreams of Springfield's children. The horror genre's traditional territory of dreams and nightmares gives the show access to the character's unconscious material in a way that the main canon's sitcom framework prevents. And what do the children of Springfield dream about? Being chased, being consumed, being pursued through landscapes that are recognizably Springfield, that contain the school and the neighborhood and the familiar geography of the town, but rendered in the distorted, threatening, logic-resistant way that dream versions of familiar places always appear. The children of Springfield dream about their actual environment, but experienced without the normalizing filter that daytime life requires. Without the filter, Springfield is a nightmare. This is the Treehouse of Horror's real secret. It isn't that the Halloween episodes reveal a darker version of Springfield that exists in some parallel dimension. It's that they reveal the psychological reality of a town whose residents have suppressed their accurate perception of their environment so completely that the suppressed material can only surface in fictional form. In dreams, in stories told in the dark, in horror. Springfield's children know, at some level, that waking life won't let them access, that their town is dangerous, that the laughter is a coping mechanism, that the comedy is a defense. And in the Treehouse of Horror episodes, where the defenses are down and the genre has changed and the rules of the main show no longer apply, what surfaces is the anxiety that was always there underneath the cartoonish jokes. There is one Treehouse of Horror episode that illuminates this more directly than any other, and it comes from a place nobody expects. In Treehouse of Horror 5, one of the most celebrated Halloween specials in the show's run, the third segment is Time and Punishment, in which Homer accidentally travels back in time using a broken toaster and alters the past in increasingly catastrophic ways. The segment is famous for being funny and clever and inventive, but look at what it's actually doing. Homer, liberated from the fixed timeline of Springfield's present, discovers that the world is extraordinarily sensitive to even small alterations. Every change he makes ripples outward in ways he can't predict or control. The world is fragile in ways that his ordinary life in Springfield never hints at. Springfield's routine is so rigid, so locked, so resistant to change that Homer never encounters evidence of the world's sensitivity during normal operation. The reset button fires so reliably that the concept of irreversible consequences has been effectively removed from his experience. But when the reset button is taken away, when Homer is allowed to operate in a reality where actions have lasting effects, the world unravels almost immediately. This is a Treehouse of Horror segment delivering a thesis statement about the main show. Springfield's episodic reset isn't just a narrative convenience, it's a cognitive prosthetic. It's a device that compensates for the population's inability to process cause and effect in a world where their judgment has been impaired. Without the reset, without the mechanism that undoes consequences before they can accumulate, the Springfield we know doesn't just change, it collapses. The horror anthology format is the only space in which the show can explore this, because exploring it in the main canon would require the show to acknowledge what the reset is compensating for. And the main canon cannot do that. The main canon depends on the reset being invisible, on the consequence-free recovery being treated as normal rather than as the carefully maintained fiction that it is. Every Treehouse of Horror episode is, in this light, an experiment. What happens if we remove the safety mechanisms? What happens if we let the consequences accumulate? What happens if we follow Springfield's premises to their logical ends without comedy intervening to cushion the impact? What happens is horror. Actual horror. The genre-appropriate kind, but also the kind that feels true in a way that the regular episodes can't afford to feel. The children of Springfield dream about being consumed because the town is consuming them. The adults of Springfield die in elaborate fictional scenarios because the real mechanisms of their destruction are too mundane and too slow and too well concealed to make for good television. The monsters of Treehouse of Horror are, almost without exception, externalized versions of the forces that are already present in Springfield's normal life. The zombie plague that consumes the population is what chronic environmental toxicity looks like in horror genre translation. The aliens who conquer the town are what corporate and political control looks like when the metaphor is made literal. The time travel that unravels reality is what Springfield's floating timeline looks like when you remove the safeguard that keeps it from being perceived as the problem it represents. Every year in October, the show tells you the truth about Springfield. And every November, it takes it back. There's a specific image from the Treehouse of Horror episodes that has stayed in the cultural imagination far longer than most individual story beats from any single episode. It comes from the segment Clown Without Pity, in which a Krusty the Clown doll is revealed to be a malevolent killer. The segment is primarily a parody of the Chucky films, broad and comic, and not particularly interested in saying anything beyond the genre reference. But Krusty the Clown himself is a detail that rewards the kind of attention the Treehouse of Horror episodes aren't usually given. Krusty is Springfield's icon of entertainment, the clown who performs for the town's children, the television personality whose image is on every piece of merchandise that Bart owns. Krusty is, within the show's universe, the cultural touchstone of Springfield's childhood. He's what the kids watch. He's what they trust. He's the face of fun and celebration and the permission to enjoy yourself without thinking too hard. And Krusty, in the main canon as much as in the Halloween episodes, is a profoundly damaged human being. He's addicted to substances. He's financially irresponsible. He's a terrible father. He's estranged from the parent whose approval he craves. He performs joy for Springfield's children while experiencing something very close to despair in his own life. The Treehouse of Horror segment in which the Krusty doll turns out to be evil is, at its core, a children's nightmare about the thing they trust most turning against them. The beloved icon becoming the predator, the entertainment becoming the threat, and the resolution of that segment, in which it turns out the doll simply had its switch set to evil rather than good, is the show's most explicit articulation of a dark joke that runs through its entire treatment of Krusty. The switch was always there, it was just set the other way. Krusty performs goodness for the children of Springfield the same way Ned Flanders performs goodness for the adults. It's a performance managed by a mechanism. When the mechanism malfunctions, when the switch flips, what's underneath is the opposite of what the surface presented. The Treehouse of Horror doll isn't an external horror that arrived from outside Springfield. It's Springfield's own icon of safety revealed, in nightmare form, to be what it always was beneath the performance. The annual return of the Treehouse of Horror episodes is, for the show's audience, one of the most anticipated events of the television calendar. There's a warmth to the anticipation, a familiarity. The horror is safe horror. The monsters are cartoon monsters. And you'll be back next week to see everything return to normal. But try, just for a moment, to notice the structure of that experience from a distance. Once a year, a show about a town you love and trust shows you the worst possible versions of everything that town contains. And you watch it, and you enjoy it, and you feel no anxiety about the fact that these worst versions are being presented to you because you know the reset is coming. The Treehouse of Horror is its own kind of reset mechanism. It opens a safety valve on Springfield's accumulated darkness, lets the pressure escape in the controlled form of Halloween horror comedy, and then closes the valve again before November. The darkness is acknowledged, it's given its season, and then it's put away until next October. Springfield's residents can't do this. They don't have an annual occasion on which they're permitted to see their town clearly and then return to comfortable blindness. Their suppression of the town's reality is continuous and unbroken. There's no seasonal release, no permitted glimpse. The viewers, watching from outside, get the Treehouse of Horror. The safety valve is theirs to use. The truth is available to them in horror genre form, for 1 month a year, and then it's sealed away again. The town doesn't get that. The town just keeps living in the reality that the Halloween episodes translate into nightmare. There's one more detail about the Treehouse of Horror episodes that deserves attention before we move on, and it's the most quietly disturbing detail in the entire anthology tradition. The framing sequences. Many of the Treehouse of Horror episodes open with a framing device. The family gathered around a campfire telling stories. Bart and Lisa exploring a haunted house. Homer reading from a cursed book. These framing sequences establish the anthology format and signal to the audience that what follows is a story being told by characters, not events being experienced by them. Except the framing sequences are, themselves, part of the anthology. The characters in the framing sequences are not exempt from horror. Things happen to them. The world of the framing sequence is as unstable and threatening as the stories being told within it. This creates a structure that has no safe level. There is no frame around the horror from which the characters can observe it without being exposed to it. Every layer of the treehouse of horror, from the opening gag to the final credits, is permeable to the horror it contains. There is no outside in the treehouse of horror. There is no place from which Springfield can be safely observed, which is, perhaps, the truest thing the Halloween episodes say about the town. It's worth pausing, before we move to the next theory, on something that the Treehouse of Horror episodes do that regular episodes almost never manage. They let the characters be afraid. In the main canon, Springfield's residents move through events that should terrify them with a kind of cheerful obliviousness that is one of the show's defining comic characteristics. Homer walks into situations that would produce panic in anyone with fully operational threat detection faculties and responds with confusion rather than terror. Bart confronts danger with bravado that reads as courage, but functions more like the particular fearlessness of someone who doesn't fully grasp what they're facing. The Treehouse of Horror episodes strip this away. In the horror anthology context, the characters are allowed to experience fear in recognizable forms. They run, they hide, they scream in ways that are played for comedy but that carry emotional authenticity beneath the laughter. For 1 month a year, Springfield's residents are permitted to feel the appropriate response to their situation. And the appropriate response is fear. This is not, when you think about it carefully, a trivial observation. The show's comic premise depends on the characters not being afraid of things they should be afraid of. The nuclear power plant should terrify Homer. Burns's hold over the town's economy and political structure should produce civic anxiety. The three-eyed fish should generate sustained, urgent concern. The fact that none of these things produce appropriate fear responses in the people they most directly affect is the town's central operational feature. Without the absence of fear, the town would change. The fear response would produce action. The action would produce change. Springfield is stable because its residents are not afraid. And the Treehouse of Horror episodes are the show's annual confession that the residents should be, that the fear is appropriate, that the inability to sustain it in the main canon is a symptom rather than a feature. Every year in October, the fear surfaces. Every year in November, it goes back under. And the town carries on, unafraid of the things that should be terrifying, because being afraid of them would break the loop. There's a dimension of the Treehouse of Horror episodes that connects directly to the radiation theory and the memory problem in ways that the show itself has never articulated. The Halloween specials operate on a different set of physical rules than the main canon episodes. Characters die in them. The deaths are real within the context of the episode and don't carry over to the main continuity. The laws of physics are more flexible. The supernatural is real in a way it isn't quite real in the regular episodes. This special status has always been treated as the creative freedom that the anthology horror format affords. And it is. But within Springfield's universe, the question is worth asking. What makes the Treehouse of Horror episodes different? What is it about October, about Halloween, about the particular atmospheric conditions of that one period in Springfield's annual cycle that causes the rules to change? One reading is that the Halloween episodes are the moments when Springfield's suppression infrastructure breaks down most completely. The collective agreement to maintain the agreed-upon version of reality, the one in which the fish mutation is not a crisis and the billionaire employer is not a threat and the yellow skin is not a symptom, weakens during October. The town allows itself, for 1 month a year, to see things that the rest of the year's social contract requires it not to see. The horror the Treehouse of Horror episodes depict isn't imported from outside Springfield. It comes from inside the town, from the things Springfield contains and denies. Aliens who want to harvest humans. A plant that becomes monstrous. Death that arrives without warning and without fairness. The loss of control over one's own mind and body. These are the fears of a population that, on some level, knows what's in the water and has agreed not to think about it for 11 months of the year. In October, the knowing surfaces, and then November arrives, and the knowing goes back under, and Springfield wakes up on the other side of Halloween exactly where it was before, having spent a month rehearsing the acknowledgement of its own horrors and having decided, once again, to keep those horrors in the category of entertainment rather than the category of reality. The anthology structure of the Treehouse of Horror episodes does something to time that the regular episodes don't. The 3 stories in each Halloween special are explicitly disconnected from the main continuity, and they're also disconnected from each other. Each story is complete in itself. There's no shared thread between the first, second, and third segments beyond the hosting device. Springfield in these episodes exists as a set of disconnected possible futures and alternative realities, each one complete and self-contained and sealed off from the others. This is, structurally, a representation of the many worlds version of Springfield's history. All the things that could have happened to it, all the disasters and transformations and ends that the town has narrowly avoided or has experienced in other timelines, are visible in the Treehouse episodes. They're not the main show, but they're not nothing. They're the shadow universe of Springfield's possibilities, running alongside the main continuity, reminding you every October of everything the town has survived and everything it could still become. Number, Section 3. Bart's Lost Future, The Dark Timeline. If you've spent any time with Simpsons fan communities, you've probably encountered the flash-forward episodes. Lisa's wedding, Bart to the future, future drama. The show has always been willing, occasionally, to speculate about the futures of its characters, to show you who Bart might become, who Lisa might become, what the family might look like if time were actually allowed to pass. These episodes are usually treated as novelties, what-if scenarios. Interesting for an episode, then set aside. The show returns to the floating present, and the flash-forward is filed away as one possible future among many, none of them binding, all of them speculative. But Bart's futures across these episodes form a pattern that the show has never addressed directly. And the pattern is not flattering, and it is not accidental. Across every flash-forward episode, across every glimpse of who Bart Simpson becomes, when the show allows time to pass, Bart ends up in the same general position. Behind, stalled, living a life that is smaller than the one he could have had. Working jobs that don't use whatever potential he possessed as a child. Inhabiting spaces that feel cramped and disappointing compared to the grandeur of his childhood imagination. Bart's future, in every version the show has offered, is a diminishment. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's in such sharp contrast to how Bart is presented in the show's present. In the floating now of Springfield's eternal 1989 through present, Bart Simpson is alive. He's electric. He's the character most associated with the show's early energy, with the sense that The Simpsons was genuinely subversive and dangerous and willing to thumb its nose at authority in ways that American television hadn't quite done before. Bart was a cultural phenomenon. He appeared on t-shirts and lunchboxes and in the consciousness of a generation. And the show, when it imagines his future, turns him into someone who missed the exit. In Lisa's wedding, the most detailed flash-forward the show has produced, we see adult Bart primarily as Lisa's older brother, the one who hasn't quite figured it out yet. He's there, present, affectionate, but peripheral to his own life in a way that reads as melancholy rather than comic. He's become the guy at the family gathering who you're happy to see but vaguely worried about. In Bart to the Future, the episode that introduced the Trump presidency joke that would haunt the show for decades, the glimpse of adult Bart is even less flattering. He's living in a state of arrested development, occupying space that isn't quite his, relying on his sister's success in ways that speak to a fundamental failure to launch. The episode uses this Bart primarily as a comic foil for Lisa's presidential storyline, but the comic role it assigns him is the specific kind of comedy that comes from recognition. He's funny because he's recognizable, because everyone knows someone like this. The person who was full of potential and promise in childhood, who generated excitement and expectation in everyone around them, and who then somehow didn't convert any of that into the kind of life those around them expected. Now ask the question the show doesn't ask. Why does Bart become this person? The show's answer, insofar as it offers one, is character. Bart is impulsive. Bart doesn't respect authority. Bart avoids responsibility. These are the traits that make him entertaining in childhood and that, when projected into adulthood, produce the disappointing outcome the flash-forwards depict. He didn't do the work. He didn't grow up. He didn't apply himself. The failure is his own. But the show itself, if you've been paying attention across 36 seasons, has provided a different answer. An answer that lives in the background of every Bart storyline. That surfaces occasionally in moments the show treats as gags, but that accumulate over time into something that looks less like comedy and more like diagnosis. Bart Simpson has been failed by every institution that was supposed to help him. Start with the school. Springfield Elementary, the institution responsible for educating Bart and every other child in Springfield, is, by any reasonable measure, an educational catastrophe. The school loses its funding repeatedly. The teachers are, with the exception of Miss Hoover, who is herself chronically depressed and barely functional, either incompetent, burned out, or simply absent. Groundskeeper Willie, the school's maintenance worker, is better characterized and more consistently present than most of the teaching staff. Bart's educational experience at Springfield Elementary is not simply that of a child who doesn't try. It's the experience of a child who is repeatedly failed by a system that doesn't have the resources, the energy, or the institutional commitment to meet him where he is. Bart has an unconventional learning style. He's kinetic and impulsive, and responds to stimulation rather than to the kind of patience-intensive, desk-bound instruction that traditional education requires. There are brief, recurring moments in the show where a teacher or a mentor connects with Bart's particular way of engaging with the world, and in those moments, something remarkable happens. He lights up. He engages. He demonstrates a capacity for learning and creativity and problem-solving that the regular classroom systematically fails to access. And then the moment passes, and Bart is back in a seat that doesn't fit him, in a classroom that has no use for what he is, being measured by standards designed for a different kind of mind. The show has addressed this directly, in an episode that doesn't get nearly enough attention in discussions of the show's more thoughtful moments. In Bart Gets an F, the Season 2 episode that remains one of the most emotionally honest in the show's history, Bart faces the possibility of being held back a year if he fails his history test. He studies, genuinely, seriously, for the first time. He tries. And when the test arrives and he fails despite his genuine effort, he breaks down. Not in a comic way. He cries. In that particular way, animated characters cry that somehow hits harder than realistic crying, because there's no performance in it. He wanted to pass. He tried to pass, and he failed anyway. He passes eventually, because of a freak snowstorm that he accurately predicts, and a teacher who recognizes his applied knowledge and gives him the passing grade he technically didn't earn on the formal test. But it's that moment of genuine failure, of trying and still coming up short, that reveals something the show usually covers with jokes. Bart's failure is not simply laziness. It's the collision between a particular kind of intelligence and a system completely unable to accommodate it. The flash-forwards show you the end result of that collision. Not the cause, not the process, not the decades of institutional failure that produce the outcome. Just the outcome, presented as character flaw. But there's an even darker layer to Bart's lost future, one that the show provides the pieces for without ever assembling them in the light. Bart's home life is, by the standards of any objective assessment, difficult. Homer's parenting, whatever warmth and genuine love underpins it, is inconsistent, frequently negligent, and regularly involving physical responses to stress that no child development professional would endorse. Homer strangles Bart. This is the show's most famous running gag. Homer's hands go around Bart's neck when he's sufficiently frustrated. It's played for comedy. It's a defining characteristic of their relationship. The audience laughs, but the show has also, in its quieter moments, allowed you to see what that relationship costs Bart. Not through dramatic confrontation, not through a very special episode about family violence, but through the texture of how Bart carries himself. The bravado that reads as confidence is, in certain episodes, revealed to be something more anxious underneath. The acting out, the pranks, the relentless provocation of authority, these are consistent with something the show never names directly. A child whose home contains an element of unpredictability about adult anger, who has learned to externalize that anxiety as performance because performance is something he can control. Bart's rebellion is, in this reading, a reasonable, adaptive response to an unreasonable environment. The school fails him. The home contains more chaos than security. The town, as we've established, is quietly poisoning him. And the response of a mind like Bart's, bright and kinetic and seeking stimulation, to an environment that offers failure and chaos and toxicity as its primary offerings, is to construct a persona that frames all of that as adventure rather than injury. The pranks are armor. The rebellions are a language for something the show never gives him the vocabulary to express. And the adult Bart of the flash-forwards, the one who's behind and stalled and living a smaller life than everyone expected, is what that armor looks like decades later, when the battles it was built to fight have been replaced by ordinary life's quieter, more persistent disappointments. There is one flash-forward that breaks from the pattern, a single glimpse of a Bart who did not diminish. It appears not in a traditional flash-forward episode, but in a couch gag from a later season, in which the family is shown aging through decades until they're elderly. And Bart, in his elder version, appears to have found some equilibrium. There's a dignity to him that the other flash-forwards deny, a sense that the story isn't finished, that the verdict isn't in. It's a couch gag. It lasts approximately 40 seconds. The show will never follow up on it. But it's there. Proof that the show can imagine a Bart who comes through. It just doesn't linger on that version. The version it returns to, the version it commits to, when it takes the time to imagine Bart's future in detail, is the diminished one, the one who fell short. The question is whether that's a realistic portrait of where someone like Bart ends up, given everything the show has shown us about his circumstances, or whether it's a choice the writers are making. A decision about who Bart is at the level of destiny rather than character? And if it's a choice, the question becomes why. One answer, the least charitable one, is that Bart's disappointing future serves the main show's needs. If Bart were allowed to become successful, to convert his childhood energy into adult achievement, the show would have to account for how that happened. It would have to acknowledge the forces that shaped him and either credit or condemn them. The disappointing Bart, the one who didn't make it, requires no such accounting. Failure is legible without explanation. Success demands a story. A more generous reading is that the show is making a statement about what happens to children like Bart, bright children in inadequate systems, children whose particular intelligence doesn't fit the available molds. And the statement is not, ultimately, optimistic. Springfield takes certain kinds of people and uses them up. It takes what they offer and absorbs it and doesn't return it in a form they can build on. Bart's energy becomes Springfield's entertainment. His rebellion becomes the town's recurring joke. His potential is spent on pranks, rather than on the things it might have built if the environment around it had been different. And by the time the future arrives, there's nothing left to convert. The potential is gone. The energy has been diffused. The person remains, but smaller than he should be. The dark timeline isn't a flash-forward episode. The dark timeline is every episode, accumulating. It's the Springfield you've been watching for 36 years doing the thing it does to everyone who lives there. Slowly, quietly, without announcement or acknowledgement, making the people inside it a little less than they could have been, a little more than they might know, and completely unaware of the difference. Bart is 10 years old. He will always be 10 years old. And somewhere in the imagined future that the show occasionally glimpses and then retreats from, he is a middle-aged man sitting in a space too small for him, the echo of something electric still present in the way he holds himself. The laughter a little too quick and a little too practiced to be entirely comfortable. He doesn't know why. The town saw to that. There's one more dimension to Bart's situation that the show touches and retreats from, and it concerns his relationship with authority in a way that goes deeper than the obvious reading of him as a rebel. Bart doesn't simply resist authority. Bart tests it. There's a compulsive quality to his provocations that suggests he's trying to establish something each time he antagonizes Principal Skinner or defies Homer or pushes against whatever rule presents itself. He's checking. He's finding out what the structure is made of, whether it will hold, whether the people inside it can be trusted to enforce it consistently and fairly. The pattern of a child who tests authority compulsively in this way, who cannot leave a rule alone without investigating its tensile strength, is often associated in developmental psychology with children who have experienced authority as inconsistent or unreliable. Children whose experience of adults in positions of power includes a significant component of unpredictability, for whom the question of whether the structure will hold is not rhetorical because they've experienced structures that didn't. Homer's authority over Bart is inconsistent by definition. Homer's emotional regulation is inconsistent. The household's rules and consequences are inconsistent. Bart has grown up in an environment where authority is real but capricious, where the same behavior produces wildly different responses depending on what kind of day Homer is having. where the structural guarantee of consistent treatment that children need to feel safe is replaced by the nervous watchfulness of someone who has learned to read the emotional weather of the adults around them. Bart's rebellion isn't a personality quirk, it's a survival strategy. The pranks aren't simply mischief. They're the actions of a child who has decided, reasonably and on the basis of accumulated experience, that he'd rather be the one causing the unpredictability than being subject to it. It's easier to manage an environment you're actively disrupting than to passively wait to see what the environment will do to you. Springfield didn't just fail Bart through its institutions. It failed him through the specific family environment that Springfield's conditions, the radiation and the economic stress and the cognitive impairment and the accumulated damage produced. And the adult Bart of the flash forwards is the person that survival strategy grew into when the situation that required it was no longer present. The armor remained after the battle ended. The disruption continued after there was nothing left to disrupt. The rebellion persisted as a habit of being long after it ceased to serve the purpose it was built for. That's the dark timeline. Not a future where something terrible happened to Bart. A future where the things that already happened to him turned out to be enough. The dark timeline reading of Bart's future becomes more troubling when you examine the specific moments in the main show where Bart comes closest to a different outcome. The substitute teacher episode, where a teacher actually reaches him, actually sees him, actually provides the kind of intellectually engaged attention that Bart has been starved of since before he could articulate the starvation. Bart responds immediately and completely. He doesn't just perform engagement. He is engaged, genuinely and visibly, in a way that the show treats as remarkable because it is. A boy who is chronically disruptive and resistant becomes focused and participatory the moment someone teaches in a way that can reach him. The substitute leaves. Springfield's institutional logic removes the exception and returns to the rule. And Bart goes back to his baseline, the mischief and the underperformance and the graduated indifference that Springfield Elementary has always produced in him. This episode is sometimes read as a story about attachment and loss, about Bart's difficulty sustaining connection with mentors or positive figures. That reading is accurate, but it's incomplete. It doesn't account for the institutional dimension, the fact that the substitute teacher's pedagogical approach is the aberration rather than the standard. Springfield Elementary doesn't produce substitutes like that regularly. It produces Principal Skinners and Mrs. Krabappels, people whose capacity to engage effectively with their students has been ground down by the same institutional logic that has ground down their students' capacity to learn. The exception proves the rule. Bart can learn. The institution cannot consistently create the conditions for learning, and the absence of those conditions, sustained across all the years Bart spends inside the institution, produces exactly the future the flash-forwards depict. The dark timeline isn't inevitable. It was produced by choices. Institutional choices, economic choices, choices about what a town like Springfield chooses to invest in and what it chooses to neglect. The darkness was designed, even if nobody designed it consciously. It is the natural output of a system that was never set up to produce anything else. The deepest version of Bart's dark timeline theory concerns not what he becomes, but what he understands. In the flash forwards, adult Bart is not shown as someone who has spent his adulthood in a state of angry, articulate resistance to the conditions that produced his diminishment. He's shown as someone who has accommodated, who has made peace in the specific way that people make peace when the alternative requires more energy than the peace does, with the distance between what he might have been and what he is. The accommodation is the darkest part. Not the failure itself, but the quiet that follows the failure, the absence of protest, the settling into the life that was produced by the institutions and the environment, and the accumulated small decisions that the 10-year-old Bart Simpson couldn't have made any differently. The dark timeline is dark not because Bart is in pain in it. It's dark because in it, Bart seems mostly fine. The question of what Bart would have been in a different institutional context has a partial answer within the show's own canon. The show has given Bart moments of unexpected competence, moments where the particular configuration of his intelligence and energy turns out to be exactly what a specific challenge requires. These moments are played as surprises because the show's default presentation of Bart as the academic failure makes competence surprising. But they're not actually surprising if you've been paying attention to what Bart is and what he's been deprived of. Bart is not unintelligent. He is very good at the things that Springfield Elementary has no apparatus for measuring or valuing. He reads social situations with extraordinary accuracy. He understands the dynamics of groups and knows instinctively how to move within them. He is a natural leader in contexts that his peers choose to follow, rather than in contexts imposed by institutional authority. He's creative in ways that his grades never reflect, because his creativity doesn't express itself through the channels the institution provides. What the dark timeline reveals is that these gifts, without institutional support to develop them, have not made him exceptional. They've made him charming and frustrated and capable of far more than he's been given the opportunity to do. The intelligence is still there in adult Bart. The social acuity is still there. But the frame that would have turned these things into a sustainable identity was never built. And without the frame, the gifts drift. Number. Section 4. Marge's Secret Breakdown. The most overlooked character in television. Marge Simpson has the hardest job in Springfield. This sounds obvious. Marge is the family's center of gravity, its emotional infrastructure, the person who holds the household together through Homer's disasters, and Bart's catastrophes, and Lisa's crises, and Maggie's extraordinary secret intelligence. Of course her job is hard. The show tells you this constantly. It's part of her characterization. But the hardness of Marge's job is treated, in the show, as a feature of her personality, rather than as a condition imposed on her by her circumstances. The show frames Marge as someone who is, by nature, the stabilizing force, the one who worries, the one who holds it together, as if this is who she simply is, rather than who she was required to become by a set of circumstances she didn't fully choose. The theory worth sitting with, the one that the show builds the pieces for without ever assembling them in a way it can fully acknowledge, is this. Marge Simpson is not a naturally stable person performing stability because that's who she is. Marge Simpson is an extraordinarily anxious person who has constructed a performance of stability because the alternative, the complete expression of the anxiety beneath the performance, would be the end of the family as it exists. Marge's anxiety is not hidden in the show. The show depicts it constantly. Her hair is the most famous physical barometer of her internal state in television history. The Tower of Blue rises and tightens, and occasionally collapses in direct response to the stresses she's managing. Her voice carries tension in specific frequencies that the show's audio design deploys with remarkable precision. There are Marge episodes built around her, where the anxiety is the subject. She goes to a psychiatrist, she develops agoraphobia, she becomes addicted to gambling. She experiences something that the show carefully avoids diagnosing, but that reads unmistakably as the kind of anxiety disorder that results from sustained, long-term, never adequately processed stress. And then the episode ends. The specific anxiety of that episode is addressed. Marge returns to baseline. And the show continues. But the baseline keeps shifting. If you watch the show longitudinally, if you track Marge across seasons rather than episode by episode, you notice that the anxiety the show brings to the surface in dedicated Marge episodes never fully retreats. It becomes part of the background texture of her character. The version of Marge in Season 12 is slightly more tightly wound than the version in Season 5. Not dramatically, not in ways that any individual episode flags as significant, but the accumulation is visible. She is, across 36 years, being slowly pressed into a shape that takes more and more energy to maintain. The gambling episode is worth returning to, because it does something that most Marge episodes don't. It shows you Marge's interiority directly. In Dollar Springfield, Homer becomes the owner of a casino, and Marge develops a gambling addiction that she struggles to conceal from the family. The episode is funny. It's also quietly devastating. What Marge finds at the casino is not primarily the thrill of winning. What she finds is a few hours of not being responsible for anything. A space in which nobody needs her. Nobody is looking to her for stability. Nobody is bringing her their disasters to manage. She sits at the slot machine and, for the first time in what is strongly implied to be a very long time, she is simply a person existing in a space without being required to be the person who holds the space together for everyone else. She becomes addicted to the relief, not the gambling. This is a clinical portrait of caregiver burnout presented in comic form, and the show knows it. The episode earns its laugh lines through the recognition of something real, and what's real in it is the picture of a person who has been performing a particular function for so long, so thoroughly, so without adequate rest or support, That the first moment of genuine relief she experiences tips immediately into compulsion. Marge's version of losing control is gambling. Other people's versions are other things. The specific form is less important than the structure, which is a person whose self-regulation resources have been exhausted finally finding a release valve and not being able to moderate the release because the pressure behind it is too great. The show treats this addiction as the problem to be solved in that episode, and it is solved. Marge stops gambling. She returns to her role. The family is restored. And the audience is not invited to ask what the sustainable management of the pressure that produced the addiction might look like, because the answer would require a different kind of show than The Simpsons is. There's a pattern in Marge's storylines that operates slightly below the level of the individual episode. Every few seasons, Marge reaches a breaking point. The form varies. She has an episode of agoraphobia. She joins a protest group. She takes up painting. She considers an affair. She develops a gambling addiction. She gets her own business. She has a breakdown related to Homer's behavior. Each of these storylines is resolved. The breaking point is processed in the space of a single episode. The resolution is achieved, and Marge returns to baseline. But look at the shape of what's happening across those storylines. Each breaking point is, in its own way, an assertion of self. A moment in which Marge's identity, her needs, her desires, her personhood separate from her role as wife and mother, pushes through the performance of stability and demands acknowledgement. And each time, the acknowledgement is granted briefly and then retracted. The painting goes. The protest group membership dissolves. The gambling stops. The business closes. The flirtation with the affair is interrupted. Marge returns to the role. Every assertion of self is ultimately withdrawn, and the role reasserts itself. The show is not, I think, intentionally making a feminist argument about the suppression of women's identity within traditional domestic roles. But it is making that argument anyway, in the structure of how it handles Marge's character across its entire run. The show can imagine Marge wanting things for herself. It can imagine her pursuing those things briefly. It cannot sustain those pursuits. They always resolve in return to the domestic center. Because the show needs Marge to be the domestic center. Homer can have adventures. Bart can rebel. Lisa can crusade. Marge has to be there when they come back. If Marge leaves the center, the show loses the thing that makes the center hold. And Marge knows this. At some level of her characterization, in the moments the show allows her genuine interiority, there is a person who understands perfectly the terms of the arrangement she's in. Who knows that the adventures are not available to her in the way they're available to Homer? Who understands that her resilience is not just a personal characteristic but a structural requirement of the family's functioning? Who has accepted this? Not entirely without grief. The episodes that allow Marge to grieve this, to feel the weight of it, even briefly, are the show's most honest Marge moments. The ones where she doesn't quite suppress the flicker of something that reads unmistakably as the question she's learned not to finish asking. The question about what her life might have looked like if the terms had been different. Homer doesn't ask this question. Homer lacks the reflective capacity to construct it. Bart doesn't ask it because he's still young enough to believe the future is open. Lisa asks it constantly and can't stop asking it, and pays a significant emotional price for the inability to stop. Maggie doesn't ask it because Maggie has decided that not asking is the wisest strategy. Marge asked it once, or close to once, and then she put it away, because she had understood by then that the answer wouldn't change the terms, and the terms were what the family needed her to accept. Springfield as a town requires certain kinds of people to perform certain functions. The town needs a Homer who will absorb damage and recover without memory. The town needs a Bart who will express rebellion safely, who will perform resistance in ways that never actually threaten the structure being resisted. The town needs a Lisa who will ask the right questions in ways that never quite gather the force to produce answers. And the town needs a Marge who will hold it all together, who will be the gravity that keeps everyone in orbit, who will perform stability so consistently and so completely that the performance becomes indistinguishable from the person. The secret breakdown is that the performance has cracks, that the stability is maintained at a cost the show can show but not quite acknowledge. That the blue-haired woman standing in the kitchen of the house on Evergreen Terrace, making dinner and managing disasters and holding everyone together with the quiet force of someone who has accepted their role completely, is not quite as complete in that acceptance as the performance requires. The hair doesn't lie. It never lies. In the seasons where Marge is most visibly stressed, The hair tightens almost imperceptibly. The tower rises. The architecture of the performance becomes slightly more rigid, slightly more brittle, as if the internal scaffolding is working harder. And every episode ends with everything back to normal. The scaffold holds, the performance continues. Marge is there at the start of the next episode, steady and present, and the center of the family's gravity. But the accumulation is there, if you watch for it. The cost of 36 seasons of being the one who holds it together is written in the progressive tightening of the tower, in the occasional flicker of something unresolved passing across those wide eyes, in the way the smile sometimes arrives a fraction of a second after the occasion for it, rather than with it. Marge Simpson is not broken. She is bending under a weight that the show has never adequately quantified, and she is holding, which is the impressive thing, the thing the show asks you to marvel at, without asking you to be troubled by what the holding costs her. The most honest sentence the show ever gave her comes from a moment that the episode treats as comedy. Homer has done something characteristically catastrophic. The damage is significant. The situation requires management. And Marge, looking at the wreckage, says something along the lines of, "I don't know why I do this." The episode doesn't linger on it. The joke lands, the scene moves, but the sentence is there, in the archive of 36 years of Springfield's collective memory. A woman looking at the thing she spent her life managing and, for one unguarded moment, not knowing why. That's the secret breakdown. Not a dramatic collapse. Not a moment of surrender. Just one honest sentence, briefly present, quickly covered. The performance reasserting itself before anyone has to sit with what the honesty revealed. What makes Marge's situation particularly poignant and particularly resistant to easy resolution is that she is not an unwilling participant in her own situation. She loves Homer, she loves her children. She loves the house on Evergreen Terrace in the specific way that people love the places that have become the containers of their most important experiences. The stability she maintains is not purely an obligation. It's also an expression of genuine attachment to the people and the home and the life she has built. This is the most sophisticated thing the show does with Marge's characterization, and it's the thing that makes the secret breakdown reading more complex and more compassionate than a simple critique of domestic limitation would allow. Marge is not trapped in a life she doesn't want. She's bending under the weight of a life she chose and genuinely loves, while also being bending under that weight in ways that the choice and the love don't fully compensate for. Both things are true simultaneously. The love is real, the cost is real, and the show, at its best, holds both of these things together without resolving the tension between them into something simpler than it actually is. There's a version of Marge's story in which she's a victim of her circumstances, and a version in which she's a person making ongoing choices that reflect her genuine values and priorities. The show has been telling both versions simultaneously for 36 years, which is part of why Marge is so difficult to write about cleanly. She resists the reading that makes her purely sympathetic, and she resists the reading that makes her choices straightforwardly legible. She's a person doing the best she can in a situation that is genuinely difficult, with love and with anxiety and with occasional glimpses of the question she's learned not to finish asking. And she holds. And the tower of blue hair rises. And the family continues. And the show asks you to be moved by her without quite asking you to be disturbed. And the most honest response to Marge Simpson, the most faithful reading of what the show has spent 36 years showing you, is probably to be both. There's a specific recurring visual in episodes centered on Marge that gets very little analytical attention: the kitchen. Marge's relationship with the Simpson kitchen is one of the show's most consistent and most loaded pieces of visual characterization. She is in the kitchen constantly. She produces food from the kitchen with a regularity and a volume that borders on industrial. The kitchen is her primary physical space within the household. This would be unremarkable in a show made 2 or 3 decades earlier, when the domestic assignment of kitchen labor to the female character was simply the default visual grammar of the family sitcom. The Simpsons is not that show. The Simpsons has, across 36 years, demonstrated substantial awareness of the gender dynamics it depicts and has, in many episodes, engaged critically with them. Marge's situation is not presented without irony. The show knows what it's doing when it puts Marge in the kitchen. What makes the kitchen significant in Marge's character study is not that she's there, but how she's there. The episodes that center on Marge's internal life, the gambling episode, the painting episode, the car wash episode, All the moments when Marge's subjectivity is briefly the show's primary concern tend to be structured around Marge leaving the kitchen. Not metaphorically, physically. She goes somewhere else, does something else, encounters a version of herself that the kitchen's spatial and social logic doesn't contain. And at the end of these episodes, she comes back. The kitchen reasserts itself. The domestic infrastructure reconstitutes around her return. And the show treats this not as tragedy, exactly, but as the complicated truth of a person whose chosen life contains both genuine love and genuine constraint, and who navigates between these things with a competence and a grace that the show asks you to admire without quite asking you to. Question whether the admiration is the appropriate. Response. The kitchen is Marge's container and Marge's domain. It is both limitation and mastery. And the secret breakdown, when it comes, is always located somewhere in the space between those two things. The specific character of Marge's anxiety, distinct from her worry and her management of the household's practical concerns, is expressed most clearly in her relationship with the color blue. Her hair is an impossible shade of blue that she has maintained in exactly the same architectural configuration for 36 years. The hair is famous as a visual joke, as an iconic image, as the show's most recognizable visual shorthand for Marge as a character. But within the logic of Marge's psychology, the hair is interesting as an act of will. In a life organized around accommodation and management, and the suppression of her own emotional weather for the benefit of the people around her, the hair is the thing she controls completely. It's impractical. It's maintenance-intensive. It serves no function beyond itself. It is, in that sense, the most purely personal thing about Marge's appearance. The one feature of her self-presentation that serves no one else's comfort or convenience. The blue tower is Marge's signature. It's also, if you read it correctly, the flag she plants in the territory of her own existence. I am here, I choose this. This part is mine. There is an episode quiet enough that it tends not to appear in greatest hits compilations, in which Marge is asked directly what she wants. Not what the family needs. Not what would help Homer. Not what Bart requires or Lisa deserves. What Marge wants. And the answer she gives is halting and surprised and reveals something that 36 years of watching her provide for others has almost obscured. She's not sure. The question finds her unprepared. The habit of translating her own wants into wants for others. The reflex of converting personal desire into household need so efficiently and automatically that the conversion is invisible even to her has made the direct form of the question almost illegible. This is not a unique experience. It's the experience of many people who have organized their adult lives around the needs of others, who have become so fluent in the language of care and management that the language of personal desire has atrophied from disuse. Marge is extraordinarily competent at understanding what her family requires. She is, by comparison, a relative novice at understanding what she herself wants when the family is removed from the equation. The show gives her this moment and then moves past it. But the beat is there, and it is, in its quiet way, the most honest single moment of Marge Simpson's characterization. The blue hair, when you think about it as a sustained act of will rather than a visual convention, tells you something important about what Marge has preserved inside the accommodation. The hair is impractical. It requires maintenance. It is in its refusal to conform to the laws of physics or to any hairstyle that could be described as low maintenance, a declaration of sorts. Not a loud declaration. Marge doesn't make loud declarations. The loud declarations are Homer's department and Bart's and Lisa's. This one is quiet. It's the kind of declaration that reads as personal eccentricity to the outside eye and means something else entirely to the person making it. Marge is, by every visible measure, someone who has organized her existence around the needs of others. The house functions because she makes it function. The family's emotional temperature is regulated, when it can be regulated, by her attentiveness to what each of its members needs at any given moment. She is the household's infrastructure. She knows this. She has, in various episodes across 36 years, acknowledged it with varying degrees of clarity and varying amounts of the particular bitterness that tends to accumulate in people whose labor is constant and whose recognition of that labor is intermittent. And through all of it, the hair rises, unchanged, impractical, maintained at considerable effort, completely her own. You can read it as vanity, which the show occasionally invites you to do. You can read it as comic visual shorthand, which it also is. Or you can read it the third way. as the thing that Marge has refused to make smaller or more convenient, the one feature of herself that serves no household function and answers to no one's needs but her own. The hair is Marge's territory. In a life organized extensively around other people's territories, she keeps this one. She has always kept it. That's not nothing. In the architecture of a life like Marge Simpson's, that's actually quite a lot. Number. Section 5. Springfield's hidden economy and the poor door. Springfield has a functioning economy. This seems obvious and unremarkable until you start trying to make sense of it, at which point it becomes one of the most structurally incoherent aspects of the show and one of the most revealing. Homer Simpson earns a salary working at the nuclear power plant. The show has been inconsistent about exactly what that salary is, but various episodes have placed it somewhere between $25,000 and $50,000 per year, with most estimates clustering around the lower end of that range. On this salary, Homer supports a family of 5 in a house that, by the standards of any American housing market, represents a comfortable middle-class property. He drives a car. The family takes vacations. Some of them elaborate. The children participate in extracurricular activities. The household has cable television and in later seasons appears to have various upgraded technologies. This is, by the economic logic of the actual United States, implausible. On $25,000 to $40,000 a year, supporting a family of 5 in owned property with regular vacations would require either significant debt, significant additional income sources not depicted in the show, or a cost of living in Springfield that doesn't correspond to anything in the real American economy. The show has acknowledged this implausibility occasionally and jokingly. There are episodes where the family's finances become a storyline, where Homer's income is suddenly revealed to be insufficient, where the gap between what the family appears to have and what Homer's salary can actually provide becomes briefly visible. And then the episode resolves and the financial architecture of the family's life returns to its implausible but functional state. But the interesting question isn't why the Simpsons can afford things on Homer's salary. The interesting question is what kind of economy is operating in Springfield to make this possible, and what that economy reveals about the town's actual structure. Springfield is a company town. This is not a theory. It's a fact that the show has established repeatedly and that analysis consistently confirms. The nuclear power plant is the primary employer and the primary generator of economic activity in the region. Burns owns the plant. Burns owns the town's primary source of electricity. Burns has interests in various other local businesses. Burns has relationships with local politicians that function as a form of control over municipal decision-making. In a company town, wages are often low because the company controls the local economy sufficiently to suppress competition for labor. But there's a compensating mechanism. Company towns tend to have artificially depressed costs for basic goods and services because the company's interest in having a stable workforce in the immediate area creates an incentive to make local living affordable enough that workers don't leave to find work elsewhere. The Simpsons can live on Homer's salary because Springfield's cost of living is maintained at a level that makes this possible. And the reason Springfield's cost of living is maintained at that level is that it serves Burns's interests to have his workforce stable, local, and non-mobile. This is not an unusual economic structure in the history of American industrial development. Company towns were common in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and their dynamics have been well documented. The company provides affordable housing and goods and services to keep workers in place. The workers become dependent on the company's ecosystem. They develop no savings that could fund relocation. Their skills become specialized to the company's specific needs, making them less attractive to outside employers. And the affordability of local life, which initially seems like a benefit, gradually reveals itself as a mechanism of control. Springfield is this structure at its logical extreme. The town is so thoroughly organized around Burns's interests that the apparent comfort of working-class life there, the affordable house, the reliable paycheck, the accessible consumer goods, is not evidence of Springfield's prosperity. It's evidence of the efficiency with which Burns has organized his workforce's dependency. Homer can afford his life because Burns needs Homer to be able to afford his life. Not because Homer is comfortable, but because a Homer who can't make rent would either leave or become a source of labor unrest. The affordable life is the leash. This framework illuminates something that the show treats as a subplot in various episodes but never as the central thesis it actually is. The moments when Homer's job is threatened, when the family faces genuine economic precarity, are the moments when the leash becomes visible, when the dependency that the affordability normally conceals is suddenly, briefly legible. In seasons where Homer's job is under threat, the family doesn't simply face financial difficulty. The social fabric of their life begins to fray in ways that reveal how thoroughly that life is built on the foundation of Homer's continued employment by Burns. The house, the neighborhood, the family's social position in Springfield, all of it is predicated on the continuation of a single employment relationship. The moment that relationship is genuinely threatened, the precarity underneath the apparent stability becomes visible. And then Homer's job is restored. The threat passes, the leash tightens again, the affordable life reasserts itself, and the dependency returns to its invisible operational state. The most disturbing application of this analysis is to Springfield's working class more broadly. Homer is not the only Burns employee. The nuclear power plant employs a significant portion of Springfield's working population, and those employees are all caught in the same economic structure. Their wages are low enough to be insufficient outside Springfield's ecosystem. The cost of living is calibrated to make those wages sufficient within that ecosystem. The dependency is mutual and universal among the plant's workforce. This means that the plant's safety violations, the 342 documented violations that Burns refused to correct, are not simply a matter of corporate negligence. They are an expression of the power differential that the economic structure creates. Burns can refuse to fix the plant because his workforce cannot afford to leave Springfield. They cannot afford to leave Springfield because their wages are calibrated to be only barely sufficient within the local economy. And their wages are only barely sufficient within the local economy because Burns controls enough of the local economy to prevent wage competition. The radiation isn't just a physical hazard, it's an economic one. The workers who are being poisoned are the same workers whose economic dependency prevents them from responding to the poisoning by leaving or organizing or demanding accountability. Springfield has a poor door. Not a literal one, not a door marked with signage, but an invisible boundary within the town's geography and social structure that divides the people who benefit from Springfield's economy from the people who pay for those benefits with their health and their labor and their futures. Burns's estate is in Springfield, but not of it. It sits at a remove from the neighborhoods where the plant workers live, the neighborhoods where the yellow people live, in a place whose architecture and grounds and fundamental aesthetic communicate that its occupant is not subject to the same conditions as the town below. This is not unusual. Wealth has always operated this way. The person at the top of the economic hierarchy is insulated from the consequences of the systems they operate. But Springfield makes it visible in a way that most fictional settings don't, because the town is small enough and the concentration of power is extreme enough that the insulation is almost comically complete. Burns, breathing what is presumably somewhat better air in his elevated estate, maintained by weekly radiation treatments that cost more than most Springfield residents earn in a year, is the clearest possible illustration of the poor door principle. The economy generates the conditions that damage the population. The damage is disproportionately concentrated in the people with the least ability to avoid it. And the person who benefits most from the economy is the person most thoroughly protected from its costs. There's a subplot in the show's economic structure that involves the other end of the wealth spectrum, and it's worth noting because it reveals the totality of the design. Springfield has a visible underclass. The show depicts poverty in Springfield, occasionally and without extensive analysis, through characters like the sea captain, through the residents of the housing project that appears occasionally in background shots, through the implication that there are people in Springfield for whom even the affordable working-class life of Homer Simpson represents aspiration rather than reality. These characters don't get Treehouse of Horror episodes. They don't get flash-forward storylines. They appear in the background of Springfield's social world and then disappear again, their poverty treated as texture rather than as the specific human condition it represents. But they're there. They've always been there. In the margins of the show that the main characters' storylines don't illuminate, there's a Springfield that is poorer and harder and less cartoon comically safe than the one we're invited to spend most of our time in. This Springfield, the one below Homer's comfortable floor, is the one that receives the most direct concentration of the town's environmental damage. The most contaminated zones in any industrial community are typically the zones with the least political and economic power to resist. The people with the fewest resources are the people with the least ability to filter their water, to live in neighborhoods more distant from the plant, to access the kind of healthcare that might identify and treat the slow accumulation of radiation damage before it becomes catastrophic. Springfield's poor door doesn't just separate Burns from Homer. It separates Homer from the people below his economic floor. And the gradient of exposure, of damage, of consequence runs exactly parallel to the gradient of economic power. Burns knows this. He has always known this. The geography of Springfield's toxicity has never been randomly distributed. The people most exposed are the people least able to respond to the exposure. This is not accident. This is design. Not conscious, explicit, deliberate design in most cases, but the emergent design of a system that has been organized to concentrate benefits at the top and distribute costs downward. Homer doesn't know this, which is the final piece of the economic theory. Homer lives on a floor in the middle of the structure that he's never been given the tools to see as a structure. He experiences the affordability of his life as normal. He experiences his dependency on Burns as a job rather than as a form of capture. He experiences the Springfield economy as the background condition of existence rather than as the specific, historically contingent, deliberately maintained system that it is. The economic theory doesn't make Springfield more evil than it already appeared. It makes it more accurate. The show isn't depicting a corrupt exception to how economies work. It's depicting how economies work in the compressed, intensified, cartoon-legible form that animated satire permits. Springfield is a company town. Homer is a company man who doesn't know it. And the poor door opens inward, into all of them, every time a paycheck clears and the next week's dependency begins. There's a detail in the show's economic architecture that rarely gets the attention it deserves, which is the Quick E-Mart. Apu Nahasapi Mapatilan's convenience store is the show's most visible small business, the one Homer visits most frequently, the one that appears in the background of more Springfield scenes than almost any other commercial establishment. And the Quick E-Mart is, within Springfield's economic logic, an interesting anomaly. Apu is not a native Springfield resident. He came to Springfield from India to pursue a doctorate, found himself working at the store to pay his expenses, and eventually remained. He runs his business with a competence and a work ethic that the show consistently depicts as exceptional by Springfield standards. He knows his customers. He manages his inventory. He navigates the town's dysfunction with a strategic patience that Homer, for instance, could never sustain. And yet the Quick E-Mart operates at the margins. It survives. It doesn't flourish. Apu works impossible hours. The store's product quality is legendarily questionable. The business model depends on capturing demand from customers who have limited alternatives within the town's economic geography. The Quick E-Mart is the economic face of Springfield that the nuclear plant's dominance makes possible. In a town where Burns controls the major employer and the major utility, the small business landscape is populated by enterprises that survive in the spaces Burns's dominance leaves unfilled, rather than by prospering in genuine competition. The Quick E-Mart doesn't compete with anything because there's nothing in Springfield's economic structure that creates genuine competition in the convenience retail space. It exists because the town needs it to exist, and it persists because Apu is exceptional enough to sustain a business in conditions that would defeat someone less dedicated. This is the texture of the company town's small business ecosystem, not vibrant entrepreneurship competing in an open market. Survival businesses filling the gaps that the dominant entity leaves, staffed by people whose alternatives are limited and whose success depends on personal, exceptional effort rather than structural opportunity. Springfield's economy doesn't punish Apu. It uses him. His exceptional effort produces a service that the town's residents depend on, and the structure of the economy ensures that the benefit of that effort flows upward rather than accumulating in the form of genuine prosperity for the person providing it. The poor door is not just the gap between Burns and Homer. It's also the gap between Homer and the people below his floor, and between those people and the exceptional individuals who work harder than almost anyone else in Springfield and still can't escape the structure's centripetal pull toward the center of its gravitational field, which is always Burns. The hidden economy of Springfield has one feature that rarely gets attention, but that is, in its way, the most revealing. Moe's Tavern survives. Moe Sislak's bar should not, by any conventional economic logic, be able to sustain itself. The menu is limited. The product quality is questionable. The atmosphere is, to put it charitably, not optimized for the customer experience. The location is not particularly convenient. Mo himself is not exactly a charismatic host. By every metric that matters in the functioning of a retail hospitality establishment, Mo's should have closed within months of opening. It has been open for 36 years. The explanation that the show provides is social rather than economic. Mo's survives because Homer goes there. Homer goes there because Homer needs a place to go. And Homer needs a place to go because Homer's life contains pressures and frustrations and cognitive fog that require an outlet that is not his house and not his workplace. The bar is the pressure valve. And because Homer is the show's protagonist and the show requires him to have a pressure valve and a social space, Mo's must remain open. Within Springfield's universe, though, the economic miracle of Mo's Tavern points at something real about the role that certain kinds of establishments play in working-class communities. The bar that should close but doesn't. The diner that's been there since before anyone can remember. The barber shop where nobody particularly wants a haircut but where people go anyway. These places survive not because they're economically efficient but because they're socially necessary. Because the community around them has organized a piece of its emotional and social infrastructure around their presence, and the loss of them would require a restructuring that the community doesn't have the resources to manage. Mo's Tavern is where Springfield's men go when the weight of living in Springfield becomes briefly unmanageable. It is the community's designated space for a particular kind of low-grade despair, and its survival, economically improbable as it is one of the things that keeps the town's pressure below the level at which it would have to confront what's producing the pressure. The social function of Mo's Tavern as Springfield's pressure valve connects to something the show depicts consistently across its run. The male characters of Springfield have very few sanctioned spaces for the expression of difficulty. The culture of the town, consistent with the broader American working-class culture the show depicts, offers men very limited vocabulary for expressing emotional strain. You go to work, you come home, you watch television, you go to Mo's. The bar isn't just a location. It's one of the only social scripts available to Homer and his peers for acknowledging, without explicitly articulating, that the weight of their lives is sometimes more than can be comfortably carried in silence. The conversations at Mo's are rarely direct. They're rarely emotionally legible in a conventional therapeutic sense, but they're real. The men at Mo's are, in their roundabout and frequently absurd way, present with each other. They're there, they show up. That's what the pressure valve provides. A space where showing up is enough, where the showing up is itself the communication, and where nobody has to say anything more specific than that. The franchise economy that Apu operates within is worth examining as a structural counterpart to Homer's employment. The Quick E-Mart is a franchise. Apu works within corporate constraints that are, in certain respects, as controlling as Burns's plant, though differently organized. The franchise agreement, the corporate standards, the evaluation structures, these are the limits within which Apu's exceptional personal investment operates. He works harder than the structure requires and receives, in return, the right to continue working within the structure. The competence and the effort are not rewarded with equity. They're rewarded with permission to continue. This is the franchise economy's version of the company-town arrangement. Apu's extraordinary work ethic produces results for a corporate entity that does not produce equivalent returns for Apu. The surplus value of his exceptional effort flows elsewhere. The show presents Apu's situation with comedy and affection, but the economic structure around him is there, in every interaction with corporate evaluators, in every moment where his right to operate his store is contingent on meeting someone else's standards. Springfield's economy doesn't have one shape. It has many. They all tend in the same direction. Homer's relationship with money, when examined consistently across episodes, reveals something the show only occasionally makes explicit. Homer doesn't think of money as something he controls. He thinks of it as something that flows through. It arrives on payday and it disperses toward the mortgage and the grocery store and Mo's and the various catastrophes that Homer generates, or that generate themselves around him with the reliable frequency of a natural process. He doesn't manage money. He inhabits the flow of it, and this relationship to economic agency, or rather this relationship to the absence of economic agency, is the most faithful representation of the company-town experience that the show provides. In a genuine company town, money doesn't really belong to the worker. It belongs to the system. The worker receives a portion of the value they produce, and that portion is calibrated to keep the worker functional and present and sufficiently motivated to show up the next day, and the portion flows immediately back into the company town's economy through the company store and the company housing and the company adjacent businesses that populate the town. The worker is a conduit, not a saver, not an investor, not an accumulator of assets that might eventually provide alternatives to continued employment. A conduit, the money flows through. Homer is a conduit. He works at the plant. He receives his paycheck. The paycheck disperses into Springfield's economy. He returns to the plant. The system is closed and self-reinforcing, and Homer moves within it with the particular kind of comfort that comes from never having experienced a meaningfully different arrangement. He doesn't know he's a conduit. He knows he's a man with a job who sometimes runs out of money before the end of the month. The two descriptions describe the same thing, and the gap between them is the gap between what the company town worker knows about their situation and what their situation actually is. Number. Section 6. Sideshow Bob's Real Purpose. Sideshow Bob is the most intellectually sophisticated villain in the history of The Simpsons, and the show has been doing something with him for 30 years that it has never fully acknowledged. On the surface, Sideshow Bob is a recurring antagonist, a disgraced television performer, a failed assassin, a criminal who escapes from prison at convenient intervals to threaten Bart Simpson and then gets recaptured, usually through some combination of Bart's cleverness and Bob's own theatrical hubris. He's a magnificent comic creation, voiced by Kelsey Grammer, with an operatic commitment that makes every appearance feel like an event. Educated, eloquent, brilliant, homicidal, and ultimately defeated every time by a 10-year-old boy. The comedy of his defeat is consistent and reliable. Bob makes a plan. The plan is extraordinarily elaborate. The plan almost works. And then some trivial detail, some overlooked variable, brings the plan down. Bob is recaptured. He returns to prison. The cycle resets. But here's what that cycle is actually doing, beneath the comedy. Sideshow Bob is the show's recurring illustration of what intelligent dissatisfaction looks like in Springfield. He's a person who sees the town clearly, whose intelligence, unlike Homer's radiation-suppressed cognition, is fully operational, who understands the mechanisms of the place, the corruption, the mediocrity, the way the town suppresses and stifles and limits, and whose response to that understanding is rage. The rage is the problem. Bob's intelligence doesn't lead him to effective resistance. It leads him to elaborate, ultimately self-defeating schemes. His plans are too clever. They contain too many moving parts. They rely on variables that he, despite his intelligence, cannot fully control, because the variable he consistently fails to account for is the chaotic, unpredictable, logic-resistant nature of Springfield itself. Bob can plan for Homer's stupidity. He can plan for Wiggum's incompetence. He can plan for the institutional failures and the civic dysfunction and the general tendency of Springfield's systems to operate in his favor because the systems are broken enough to be exploitable. What he cannot plan for is the random, specific, absurdist way that Springfield's chaos tends to resolve in favor of the status quo. Springfield produces the kind of chaotic outcomes that systematically defeat sophisticated planning. This is, if you think about it, a remarkable property for a town to have. Sophisticated external attempts to change or disrupt Springfield's reality consistently fail. The dome came down eventually. Bob's assassination attempts fail. Burns's most elaborate schemes tend to collapse. The rational, calculated, sophisticated attempts to fundamentally alter what Springfield is all fail against the town's chaotic resilience. What succeeds in Springfield is not planning. What succeeds is stumbling forward in approximately the right direction and trusting that the town's reset mechanism will handle the rest. Homer doesn't succeed through intelligence or strategy. He succeeds through a combination of luck and the town's own tendency to restore equilibrium after disruption. He's calibrated to Springfield's chaos in a way that Bob is not. Bob's intelligence is his handicap, not his advantage. He can see the path clearly enough to plan for it, but he can't move through Springfield's reality the way Homer can, because Homer moves through it without seeing it, which means the reality can't trip him up in the ways it trips up someone who's trying to navigate it consciously. This is a deeply strange property for a fictional setting to have. Most narratives reward the clever character and punish the stupid one. Springfield reverses this. The stupid man survives and thrives. The clever man fails repeatedly, and the gap between them is not a comment on the value of intelligence in general. It's a comment on the specific kind of intelligence that Springfield's environment produces, selects for, and rewards. Homer's cognition is adapted to Springfield. It's the product of 36 years of radiation exposure and crayon-induced brain damage, and the particular demands of living in a place where critical thinking is a liability rather than an asset. Homer thinks in the way Springfield requires its residents to think, associatively, impulsively, without sustained analytical engagement with the larger patterns around him. And this makes him functional in a way that Bob, with his trained and operational intelligence, can never be. Bob is an outsider who looks like an insider. He grew up in Springfield, adjacent to Springfield, in its cultural orbit. But his intelligence marks him as fundamentally foreign to the town's operating logic. He can't help seeing patterns. He can't help constructing plans. He can't help being the kind of mind that Springfield's environment systematically disadvantages. There's a dimension to Bob's relationship with Bart that the show has explored across multiple episodes and that rewards the kind of attention the comedy usually deflects. Bob wants to kill Bart. This is the foundation of their relationship. Bob's hatred of Bart is sincere and long-standing. But the show has also, in several episodes, allowed something else to surface in that relationship. Something that both characters find disturbing when it becomes visible. Bob and Bart understand each other. Not in the simple sense of knowing the other's tactics, in the deeper sense of recognizing something in the other person that resonates with something in oneself. Bob sees in Bart a kind of intelligence that Springfield doesn't recognize and doesn't accommodate. A quick, unconventional, boundary-testing mind that doesn't fit the available molds. Bob sees this because he has the same quality, more developed, more educated, more consciously deployed, but fundamentally the same. And Bart sees in Bob something he doesn't have a language for yet, but that will eventually become legible to him as the distance between what a person is and what the environment allows them to be. Bob is what happens to someone like Bart if they develop full intelligence in Springfield, rather than having it suppressed. If the intelligence grows but the environment doesn't accommodate it, the result is not success. The result is Bob. This is the darkest thing the show implies about Bart's future through its Sideshow Bob episodes. The alternative to the diminished adult Bart of the flash-forwards is not success. The alternative is Bob. The version of Bart who grows up smart, who develops the full capacity of his intelligence in an environment that can't use it, doesn't become a doctor or a lawyer or an artist. He becomes someone whose intelligence serves primarily to make him more sophisticated in the elaboration of his own frustration. The comedy of Bob's repeated failures is, in this light, a mercy. Each failure returns him to prison, which returns him to a cycle, which is at least a form of structure. The cycle is its own kind of Springfield. The reset is its own kind of loop. Bob in prison is not so different from Springfield's residents in their permanent present. He just knows what loop he's in. The show has had Bob occasionally pause in his villainy to have an experience of genuine human connection. There are Bob episodes where the assassination plot is briefly suspended, while Bob encounters something that reaches him: music, literature, family, an unexpected kindness. And in those moments, the character beneath the villain is visible. A person of real depth and genuine feeling, who is in the situation he's in, not because he's fundamentally evil, but because his intelligence and his environment are so profoundly mismatched that the only form available to him is transgression. These moments don't redeem Bob. The show is too honest for facile redemption arcs. But they do complicate him in a way that the pure villain framing can't quite contain. Bob is too smart to be simply wrong about everything. He's too perceptive to be dismissed as a cartoon antagonist with no legitimate grievance. He has a legitimate grievance. The show just has him express it in ways that are impossible to endorse. He tried to kill Bart. He'll try again. He'll fail again. He'll return to prison. The cycle will continue. But somewhere in the architecture of that cycle is the show's most explicit acknowledgement that the problem is not simply bad people making bad choices. The problem is an environment that cannot accommodate certain kinds of minds, and that produces, in those minds, a combination of desperation and sophistication that can only find expression in destruction. Sideshow Bob is Springfield's mirror held up to its own face. The town sees in him the criminal genius that its own toxicity produced, and it locks him away and tries again. There's a subplot in the Sideshow Bob storylines that has accumulated across multiple episodes without ever being assembled into a coherent narrative, and it concerns Bob's family. The show has, over the years, introduced Bob's brother Cecil, his parents, and eventually his wife and son. Each of these characters shares Bob's fundamental characteristics: the intelligence, the education, the theatrical self-presentation, the incapacity for the kind of pragmatic compromise that successful social navigation requires. The Terwilliger family is, in miniature, a portrait of what a certain kind of intelligence looks like when it develops in a context that can't use it and eventually expresses itself sideways. None of them have made entirely conventional lives. None of them have found the straightforward application of their considerable capacities in the kind of professional context that those capacities should theoretically enable. They've ended up in various forms of unconventional, troubled, or transgressive situations, Bob most dramatically and visibly, but the pattern is consistent across the family. This suggests that the Sideshow Bob problem, the mismatch between a particular kind of mind and the environments available to it, is not uniquely Bob's problem. It's a Terwilliger family condition. Something about the combination of this family's particular gifts and this town's particular limitations has produced, across generations, the same basic outcome: extraordinary capacity finding no legitimate channel and eventually expressing itself in the only forms left available, which are the ones that get you arrested. Springfield doesn't just fail Bart, with his unconventional learning style and his kinetic energy and his particular intelligence. It fails the Terwilligers, with their classical education and their theatrical sensibility and their incapacity for the small compromises that ordinary social life requires. The town is too small for certain kinds of minds, and certain kinds of minds, faced with a container that can't hold them, eventually overflow in predictable directions. Bob will keep escaping. The cycle will continue, and each time he returns, he will be the town's reminder that it contains, within its own history, the conditions that produce the thing it fears. The criminal it locks away is the monster it made. There's a dimension of Sideshow Bob's situation that goes beyond his personal relationship with Bart or the town's use of him as a recurring criminal. It concerns what happens to his intelligence between his arrests. Bob is repeatedly captured, imprisoned, released, and returned to the same town where he committed his previous crimes. The recidivism is total, and the pattern is so consistent that it begins to look less like criminal compulsion and more like a structural feature of Springfield's approach to the people it cannot integrate. Springfield sends the people who don't fit to prison and then brings them back to the community where they didn't fit and waits for them to fail to fit again. There is no reintegration infrastructure. There is no supported transition back to civilian life that would address any of the conditions that produced the original failure. There is Bart. There is Springfield Elementary, where Bob's substitute teaches on occasion with the specific result that Bart is there, and Bob is there, and the cycle restarts. The town puts the thing it can't integrate back into exactly the context that produced the failure of integration, and then expresses surprise when the failure recurs. This is not unique to Springfield. It is the standard American approach to incarceration and release, particularly for people whose crimes were expressions of fundamental incompatibility with the community's institutions rather than simple economic need. Bob doesn't steal because he's poor. He commits crimes because the only forms of self-expression available to his particular combination of intelligence and ego in Springfield's institutional landscape are the transgressive ones. Removing him from Springfield and returning him to Springfield changes none of the conditions that produced the transgression. The cycle is guaranteed from the beginning. Springfield manages Bob the way it manages everything it cannot account for, by removing it temporarily and returning it unchanged, and by treating the recurrence as evidence of the individual's pathology rather than the system's failure. Sideshow Bob's relationship with opera, with theatrical performance, with classical culture generally, is the show's most sustained exploration of what happens when a certain kind of sensibility is born into a context that has no use for it. Bob's love of these forms is genuine. When he performs, when he sings the parts of operas that his situation has somehow made appropriate to the moment, the performance is real. It's not camp. It's not ironic. There is a man inside the criminal, inside the theatrical villain, for whom these cultural forms represent something essential about the experience of being alive, and the attempt to give that experience shape and meaning and dignity. Bob found these forms at some point in his development, and they answered something in him. Springfield couldn't provide the context in which that answer could be built into a life. So the answer found its way out sideways, attached to schemes and crimes and the specific character of a man who is both genuinely gifted and genuinely incapable of organizing that gift into anything the community around him can integrate. The opera at the end of the murder attempt is not a joke. It's the most honest thing about Bob. The recurring pattern of Sideshow Bob's elaborate plans is worth examining as a form. His schemes are always theatrical, always overproduced. These are not the minimal, efficient crimes of someone primarily motivated by self-interest. They're the maximally complex, maximally staged crimes of someone who needs the crime to be worthy of his intelligence, who cannot do something small when something large is available. Bob is, in this sense, a performance artist whose medium is criminality. The crime is the artwork, and the artwork must justify the artist. The ambition of the scheme reflects the ambition of the intelligence behind it. A man who can plan and execute an operatically complex criminal enterprise is demonstrating that his mind works at a level that Springfield has never provided a legitimate context for. The crime is the evidence of capability. The prosecution is the review. The sentence is the critique. And he comes back next season with something larger, something more elaborately staged. Bob isn't just a villain. He's the show's most sustained portrait of what extraordinary capability looks like when it has no legitimate outlet. And the extraordinary capability is real. Springfield just never gave it anywhere legitimate to go. The one moment in which Sideshow Bob genuinely moves past the theatrical villain role and into something that looks like selfhood, something that looks like a person rather than a performance, is consistently in his interactions with his son Bart Jr. These interactions are rare, brief, and always complicated by the ongoing criminal context in which they occur, but they're distinct from everything else Bob does. The grandeur falls away. The opera voice softens. The scheming pauses. For the duration of these interactions, Bob is simply a person in relationship with another person, and the relationship is, given everything, surprisingly warm. This isn't inconsistent with the reading of Bob as someone whose intelligence has been channeled entirely into illegitimate expression. It's consistent with it. The things people love are often the most honest things about them, the things that reveal what they'd be building toward if the building had legitimate material to work with. Bob's attachment to his son is genuine. It's the thing that, if Springfield had been different, if his particular combination of gifts had found legitimate channels, might have been the center around which a very different kind of life organized itself. Instead, it's a grace note in the middle of an ongoing criminal enterprise. Real but contextually impossible. The warmth trapped inside the architecture of the wrong life. Visible for a moment before the plot reasserts itself, and Bob's intelligence takes him somewhere that his warmth can't quite follow. There's something worth naming about the specific crime that started everything for Sideshow Bob. Framing Krusty. The show uses this as origin story, the act that defines Bob as a villain and initiates the cycle that follows. But the framing of Krusty is also, if you look at it carefully, a crime of frustration. Bob was Krusty's sidekick. Krusty is, by every objective measure, significantly less intelligent and significantly less talented than Bob, and the show depicts this without ambiguity. Krusty is a success. Bob is his assistant. The hierarchy is precisely inverted from what it would be if the hierarchy reflected capability. The framing is Bob's attempt to rearrange the hierarchy by removing the person at its top. It's the action of someone who has been passed over so systematically and so completely by a system that rewards the wrong things that the only available response to the injustice feels like a crime. Because it is a crime. And because the crime reveals something true about the injustice it was responding to, which the show handles by making Krusty's rehabilitation sincere rather than triumphant, acknowledging that the dynamic Bob was trying to upend was genuinely unfair without endorsing the method Bob chose to address it, Bob chose wrong. The thing he was responding to was real. Both of these things are true, and the show holds them both, and that's why the origin story has more texture than it first appears. Number. Section 7. The Flanders Conspiracy. Ned Flanders is the most analyzed secondary character in the history of The Simpsons, and yet the deepest layer of his mystery remains consistently underexplored. We know about the behavioral modification. We know about the suppressed rage. We know about his wife and his faith and the comprehensive unfairness of his life as the show has constructed it. But there's something running beneath all of that, something the show has placed in the structure of the Flanders storyline without ever drawing explicit attention to it, and it concerns what Ned Flanders actually represents within Springfield's power structure. Ned is, by any measure, economically comfortable. He owns his home outright. His leftorium business, the specialty left-handed goods shop in the Springfield Mall, is apparently profitable enough to sustain his lifestyle and his family. He has no apparent debt. He tithes faithfully to the church and is able to do so without apparent financial strain. His material position is, if anything, more secure than Homer's, despite Homer working for one of the wealthiest men in America. This is strange. The leftorium is a specialty retail business catering to approximately 10% of the population. It's located in a mall in a town of unclear but modest size. Its product category is sufficiently niche that it seems unlikely to generate the kind of sustained revenue that would explain Ned's financial comfort without some other source of income or capital. The show never explains this. It never explains where Ned's money comes from in sufficient detail to make the leftorium plausible as the primary source. And this is a show that, when it wants to, can be extraordinarily specific about the economics of its characters' situations. Homer's salary is discussed. Various characters' financial circumstances are depicted with specificity when those circumstances serve the plot. Ned's finances are never examined. The comfort is present, the source is vague, and the show seems to prefer it that way. One theory, the one that fits best within the show's established logic, is that the Flanders family has money from a source that predates Ned's adult life. An inheritance, a family trust, some accumulation of capital from a previous generation that provides a financial floor beneath the leftorium's revenue. This connects to what the show has told us about Ned's parents. His beatnik parents, the ones who failed to discipline him and whose negligence sent him to the behavioral modification psychiatrist as a child, are depicted as people of a certain educated social class. Not wealthy, exactly, but not without resources. The kind of people who have access to the kind of professional services that behavioral modification requires, which in the 1960s would have been quite expensive. If Ned inherited money from his parents or from a family trust that his parents managed, the financial mystery of the leftorium is partially resolved. He doesn't need the shop to be particularly profitable. He needs it to provide structure and purpose and a social position within Springfield's commercial landscape. The income is supplementary to a more stable capital base. This matters to the Flanders conspiracy because it changes Ned's relationship to Burns. Homer is economically captured by Burns. His income, his family's lifestyle, his position in Springfield are all contingent on continued employment at the plant. This creates the dependency that makes Homer so useful to Burns. Ned doesn't have this dependency. Ned's financial position, if the inheritance hypothesis is correct, is not contingent on Burns. He doesn't work for Burns. He doesn't need Burns. He exists within Springfield's economy but not within Burns's particular web of dependency. And yet Ned stays. He chooses Springfield. He commits to the community with a depth and sincerity that is, given what the show reveals about the community's dysfunction, remarkable. He attends church. He participates in civic life. He is a genuine community member in ways that most Springfield residents are not, having been produced by the community rather than choosing to commit to it. Why does someone who doesn't need to be in Springfield choose to be in Springfield? The faith is part of the answer, and it's the obvious part. Springfield is where Ned's church is, where his community of faith is, where the social structures that his behavioral modification has made necessary for his stability are located. Leaving Springfield would mean leaving those anchors, and the anchors are what keep Ned functional. But there's a darker possibility that the show puts within reach without quite grasping. What if Ned stays in Springfield? Because on some level, he understands what he provides to it. Ned is Springfield's conscience. Not literally, not in a way that the town responds to or heeds, but functionally. He's the person in the community who behaves in accordance with explicit moral principles. Who does the right thing even when no one is watching? Who maintains standards of conduct that everyone else has abandoned or never possessed? He's the benchmark, the reference point. The person whose existence allows everyone else to measure how far from rightness they've fallen. Without Ned, Springfield has no internal standard of conduct except its own dysfunction. With Ned present, the dysfunction is continuously visible as dysfunction, measured against someone who isn't doing it. Ned's presence is a form of moral accounting that the town doesn't request and doesn't acknowledge, but that operates nonetheless. In this reading, Ned isn't just the neighbor who suffers disproportionately to his virtue. He's the person who, by existing and persisting and refusing to leave, prevents Springfield from losing any remaining connection to the possibility of better conduct. The conspiracy part of the Flanders theory is this. Someone knew this was necessary. Someone placed Ned in the community adjacent to Homer with the specific understanding that Homer, Springfield's particular expression of the town's damage, needed a neighbor who would not give up on him. Not a neighbor who would enable him, not a neighbor who would excuse him, a neighbor who would persist in offering, every single week, the example of an alternative way of living. We don't know who or what made this arrangement. The show doesn't offer an answer, but the precision of the placement is too specific to feel accidental. Ned and Homer are not just neighbors who happen to have opposing characteristics. They're complementary figures whose relationship covers something that neither of them could access alone. Homer provides Ned with something too, though the show is more reluctant to examine this. A person who perpetually requires the qualities that Ned's programming instilled in him. An outlet for the patience and the forgiveness and the tolerance that his psychological cage produces. Without Homer to forgive, Ned's behavioral modification has nothing to work on. They need each other. Not in the warm, friendship-based way that the show occasionally, sentimentally gestures at. In the structural way that two opposing forces need each other to define themselves against. Homer without Ned loses his primary reference point for what a better version of his life might look like. Ned without Homer loses the continuous requirement for the exercise of qualities that his programming makes impossible to stop exercising. The show has placed them next to each other and locked them in this relationship for 36 years. Neither of them has the capacity to escape it. Homer can't see it clearly enough to do anything but accept it. Ned can't stop forgiving long enough to do anything but sustain it. And the town watches. The town has always watched this particular dynamic as background scenery, the funny neighbor and the problematic one. The contrast that the show uses as a comic device in episode after episode. But the contrast isn't primarily comic. The contrast is structural. It's two things the town produced, placed next to each other, showing each other what the other couldn't see alone. And neither of them, across 36 seasons, has managed to convey that knowledge in a form that changed anything for either of them. That's the Flanders conspiracy. Not a plot, not an explicit design, just a town so thoroughly organized around its own dysfunction that even the person whose function is to resist the dysfunction can't escape being organized by it. There is something worth examining in the specific theology of the Flanders household, because the show has built a religious landscape around Ned that is more complex than it first appears. Ned's faith is depicted as entirely sincere. Unlike religious characters in many television comedies, Ned is never a hypocrite. He doesn't preach virtue while practicing vice. He doesn't use religion as a cover for selfishness. His belief is consistent, genuine, and expressed through actual behavior rather than performed in language alone. He gives, he forgives, he attends, he lives as best he can, according to the actual content of his stated beliefs, rather than their social presentation. This makes the show's theological joke, the one where God speaks to Homer but not to Ned, much darker than it appears on the surface. Homer's relationship with God in The Simpsons is casual to the point of absurdity. Homer talks back to God. Homer negotiates with God. Homer complains to God about trivial inconveniences and receives, if not direct response, at least the sense of a relationship that has some texture and reciprocity. God appears to Homer. God tells Homer things. God is, in Homer's spiritual life, present in a way that is immediate and somewhat irreverent and entirely consistent with how Homer approaches every relationship in his life, which is with a combination of self-interest and genuine if unexamined affection. Ned prays every day. Ned reads scripture. Ned's entire framework for understanding his life, his losses, his neighbors, his future, is organized around a faith that is sincere and sustained and has cost him enormous amounts of practical utility in situations where a less principled person would have taken an easier path. Ned's faith has made him more vulnerable, not less. More forgiving than he should be, more patient with circumstances that deserve anger, more trusting of a system that has repeatedly delivered outcomes that look, from the outside, like punishment for virtue. And God doesn't talk to Ned. The show doesn't make this explicit as a theological statement, but the pattern, accumulated across dozens of episodes, is consistent. Homer has theological experiences. Ned has theological commitments. Homer receives without seeking. Ned seeks without receiving, and the show never explains why. There are a few ways to read this. One is that the universe of The Simpsons operates on a kind of ironic theology in which divine favor and moral worth have no correlation, and the joke is on the assumption that sincerity and devotion should produce results. Another is that Ned's conditioning, the behavioral modification that rebuilt him around suppression and compliance, has also disconnected him from whatever frequency God, in this universe, uses to communicate. Homer's disorder, his chaos and unpredictability, and fundamental inability to organize himself around any fixed principle, keeps him somehow open in a way that Ned's rigid structure does not. The cage that makes Ned good also makes Ned unreachable. A third reading, darker than either of those, is that God in The Simpsons is the kind of God who talks to people who don't need the conversation and stays silent with people who depend on it. Who shows up for Homer's casual theological tourism and withholds from Ned's sustained, costly devotion? This reading makes God in Springfield consistent with everything else in Springfield. A system that rewards the comfortable and ignores the earnest. That responds to ease and indifference, and turns away from effort and sincerity. That speaks to the man who fell asleep in church and maintains silence with the man who built his entire life around listening. Ned Flanders is spiritually alone in a universe where God exists and has a speaking voice and has simply chosen, for reasons the show never explains, not to direct any of it toward the most devout person in the community. The conspiracy isn't that Ned is secretly bad. The conspiracy is that the system around him is indifferent to his goodness in a way that his conditioning has made it impossible for him to confront. He cannot be angry. He cannot despair. He cannot abandon the framework. So he remains, next door to Homer, forgiving everything, receiving nothing, waiting for a conversation that the show's universe may never provide. That's the full architecture of the Flanders situation. A man rebuilt by psychology and sustained by theology, useful to the structure of the neighborhood in ways he didn't choose, rewarded with the specific kind of nothing that the town reserves for people who do everything right. One more dimension of Ned's situation deserves examination, and it concerns his children. Rod and Todd Flanders are, within the Springfield elementary ecosystem, among the most thoroughly socialized children in the school. They know the rules, they follow them, they are polite, gentle, non-disruptive, and appear, from the outside, to be exactly the kind of students that the institution they attend is theoretically designed to produce. And they are the most isolated children in the school. The Springfield elementary social structure rewards a particular kind of social energy that the Flanders children don't possess. The dominant social currencies at the school are defiance, humor, physical confidence, and a willingness to occupy space in ways that attract attention. Bart has all of these in abundance. Even children who aren't Bart have absorbed enough of the school's social grammar to know how to navigate it. Rod and Todd, raised in a household that has systematically cultivated the opposite of these traits, are fish in the wrong water. They don't speak the social language that Springfield Elementary's student culture uses. And the result is that they drift through the school as background figures, present but not integrated, visible but not quite seen. This is Ned's conditioning transmitted to the next generation. The behavioral modification that made Ned useful to Springfield's structure but incapable of true belonging has been transmitted, through the particular parenting style that modification produced, to children who now face the same structural situation. They have the traits that make them legible and trustworthy to adults and invisible and slightly alien to their peers. They are good in the way that Ned is good, which is to say in the way that produces a specific kind of loneliness that the goodness itself makes it difficult to acknowledge. The Flanders house, seen this way, is not just Ned's situation. It's a dynasty of functional isolation, very quietly perpetuating itself, one generation at a time. The Flanders household has one more structural feature that the show has never quite examined directly: its cleanliness. Ned's house is always clean. Not just tidy, which Homer's house also manages intermittently. Structurally, constitutionally clean, in a way that requires sustained and deliberate effort to maintain. The cleanliness is part of the performance of virtue, yes, and it's consistent with Ned's general orientation toward doing things correctly and visibly. But it's also, in the context of everything we know about Ned's psychology, a form of control. In a life organized around the suppression of disorder, the ordered household is the external expression of the internal project. The rooms are clear because the emotions are managed. The counters are spotless because the contained thing is contained. The house reflects the condition of its occupant. Scrupulously maintained, nothing out of place, everything in service of the appearance of a life that has its chaos successfully organized. The house is a portrait of the cage, and it is immaculate. One more observation about Ned connects the Flanders conspiracy to Springfield's broader psychology. Ned is the character most likely to accurately diagnose what is happening in any given situation, and most consistently ignored when he does. He sees things, he reports what he sees. He is not, like Homer, protected from uncomfortable truths by cognitive impairment. He sees them and says them, and nobody listens. This is the other dimension of the conspiracy. Ned as Springfield's unheeded diagnostician. He has the clarity that Homer lacks and the community standing that Lisa lacks. And the show has built, around this possibility, a very effective social mechanism for preventing it from mattering. Ned's sincerity is his disqualifier. His genuine belief in what he's saying, his inability to perform the ironic distance that would make his observations socially acceptable to a community that finds sincerity slightly embarrassing, marks his accurate perceptions as the enthusiasms of a zealot rather than the observations of a witness. Springfield keeps its most accurate observer disabled not through suppression but through the simpler mechanism of not taking him seriously. No judge, no railroad car required. You just don't listen. The Flanders house and the Simpson house face each other across a shared property line that functions, in the show's visual grammar, as a boundary between two possible versions of the same life. They're in the same neighborhood. They're in the same contamination zone. They're subject to the same economic structure and the same environmental conditions and the same Springfield that treats both of them with its characteristic combination of affection and indifference. But the houses look different, feel different, operate according to different internal logics. What makes this boundary interesting is that crossing it doesn't resolve anything. Homer visits Ned's house. Ned visits Homer's house. The contrast is visible to both of them, without either of them being able to articulate what the contrast means or what it implies about the different choices that produce the different households. Homer looks at Ned's cleanliness and neat lawn and functional gutters and sees something he doesn't understand well enough to envy. Ned looks at Homer's chaos and sees something he doesn't understand well enough to want, but that contains something, some quality of unself-conscious ease that his behavioral modification has made unavailable to him. They need each other in the way that complements need each other. Homer's disorder is legible against Ned's order. Ned's virtue is legible against Homer's failure to perform it. Remove one and the other loses the reference point that makes it visible. They are, across that property line, in a relationship of mutual definition that neither of them chose and neither of them fully understands. Each one the mirror the other can't quite see themselves in. Section 8. Lisa's saxophone and the weight she carries. There's a scene early in the show's run, not a dramatic scene, not one that gets highlighted in greatest moments compilations, in which Lisa Simpson sits alone in her room playing her saxophone. No one has asked her to play. No one is listening, or at least no one appears to be listening. The household around her is its usual organized chaos. Homer is somewhere causing some form of damage. Bart is somewhere applying his energy to some form of mischief. Marge is somewhere managing the consequences of both. And Lisa is alone, playing. The saxophone is not in the show's universe, simply a character detail. It's not one of those instruments assigned to a character to mark them as the artistic or intellectual type. The saxophone is Lisa's primary language, the one in which she can express what the family's verbal landscape has no room for, the one in which she can be fully herself in ways that the household's noise, and Homer's limitations, and Bart's dominance of the sibling relationship consistently prevent. When Lisa plays, she's not performing for anyone. She's thinking, processing, working through something that the available language, the English available to an 8-year-old in a working-class Springfield household, doesn't have adequate vocabulary to address. The weight Lisa carries is this: she knows. Not everything. Not in the way that the theories we've been exploring might suggest she does, not with the full analytical clarity of someone who has assembled the evidence. But she feels the shape of it. The wrongness, the way things don't add up, the gap between the Springfield she can see clearly and the Springfield that everyone around her insists is fine. Lisa is the only Simpson family member for whom the town's normalizing mechanism consistently fails. Homer can't see Springfield's dysfunction because his cognition is impaired. Bart can see it but responds to it through rebellion rather than analysis. Marge can see it but suppresses the seeing in service of the family's stability. Maggie, as we've established, sees everything and says nothing and waits. Lisa sees and says and never stops saying, which is why she's the character the show most consistently puts in the position of being right and being ignored. This is, for Lisa, a form of isolation that the show is relatively honest about depicting. Being the person who sees clearly in a community that has organized itself around not seeing is not a comfortable position. The isolation is the price of clarity, and Lisa pays it, visibly, in every episode where she pushes against the town's chosen blindness and finds that the blindness is stronger than her vision. The saxophone is the outlet that the isolation requires. When the language of truth isn't working, when the words she uses to describe what she sees get absorbed by Springfield's ambient denial without producing any effect, Lisa plays. The music doesn't fix anything. It doesn't change what she knows or alter what the town refuses to acknowledge. But it gives the knowing somewhere to go, somewhere outside herself where it can exist without being immediately neutralized. There's a theory about Lisa's saxophone that the show has never made explicit, but that the music itself, across 36 seasons of her playing it, seems to be making quietly and persistently. The saxophone is crying, not in a melodramatic sense, not in the way that film scores use music to signal emotion to an audience that might otherwise miss it. In the specific, particular way that jazz and blues, the musical traditions that the saxophone most naturally inhabits, have historically been forms in which things that couldn't be said directly found expression. The saxophone is Lisa's access to a tradition in which suffering and resistance and beauty and heartbreak and hope have been translated into sound by people who, for various historical reasons, couldn't translate them into the language of the dominant culture around them. Lisa is 8 years old, and she's found her way into this tradition. Not consciously, not through any explicit engagement with the cultural history of the instrument. But the show has given her this instrument rather than another one, and the choice is not arbitrary. The thing Lisa carries is the thing that instrument has always been used to carry. The show's most Lisa-centric episodes tend to follow a structure. Lisa identifies something wrong. She raises the issue. The issue is either ignored, dismissed, or temporarily addressed and then forgotten. Lisa is alone again at the end. The saxophone plays. This structure has repeated across 3.5 decades of episodes. It is, by any honest accounting, a pessimistic structure. The show is not depicting a character who learns to navigate her environment more effectively over time. It's depicting a character who keeps running into the same wall and who deals with the impact of each collision by returning to the instrument and playing. The persistence is remarkable. 8 years old for 36 years, and she hasn't stopped caring. She hasn't stopped trying. She hasn't made the adaptation that Maggie made, the decision to stop announcing herself and operate in the margins instead. Lisa is visible, deliberately, stubbornly, painfully visible in a town that would prefer she wasn't. This is, on some level, a choice the show has made about what to do with its most intellectually capable main character. It could have depicted her as more effective. It could have shown her achieving more of the changes she advocates for. It could have given her victories that stuck. It chose, instead, to show her persisting without accumulating wins. The mercy in this choice, if there is one, is that it's honest. The alternative, the version of Lisa who achieves change in Springfield through her intelligence and her advocacy, would require the show to pretend that Springfield is a place where intelligence and advocacy produce change. And the show has too much integrity for that pretense. Springfield doesn't change because Lisa is smart. Springfield doesn't change because someone is watching who can see it clearly. Springfield changes only when it has to, briefly, minimally, and it returns to its baseline the moment the pressure that forced the change has been relieved. Lisa knows this. She has known it since she was old enough to experience it, and she keeps trying anyway. This is the weight, not the specific content of what she carries, not the particular causes she advocates for, or the specific injustices she identifies. The weight is the combination of seeing clearly and continuing to try in an environment that has demonstrated, repeatedly and comprehensively, that it doesn't respond to clear sight. Most people, faced with this combination, eventually stop trying. They adapt. They find a way to see less clearly, or to apply their clear sight to smaller and more tractable problems, or to leave. Lisa hasn't done any of those things. She hasn't adapted. She hasn't retreated. She hasn't left, though she has, in flash-forward episodes, eventually grown into someone who does leave, who goes to college, who finds a world that can accommodate her in ways Springfield cannot. But in the permanent present of the main show, she hasn't left yet. She's still here, still 8 years old, still sitting in her room with the saxophone after the day's particular form of being ignored or dismissed has concluded. Still playing. The thing the saxophone is saying, across 36 seasons of being Lisa's primary expressive language, is something the show has never translated into dialogue, because dialogue would make it too explicit. What the saxophone says, in the registers of jazz and blues that Lisa unconsciously inhabits, is something like this. I see what this is, I know what's happening here, I don't know how to change it. The knowing and the not changing coexist in me, and I live inside that coexistence every day without going numb or giving up, and I don't know how long I can keep doing this, but I haven't stopped yet. That's the saxophone. That's Lisa, 8 years old, 36 years, still playing. The saxophone is the first thing about Lisa that Springfield should have taken seriously and the last thing it ever will. Consider the instrument itself as a choice, not in the real-world sense of a writer selecting a visual shorthand for a character's personality, but within the show's universe as a choice that Lisa made, or that was made available to her, at a particular moment in her development. The saxophone is a jazz instrument. Its history in American music is inseparable from the history of communities that developed jazz as a language for expressing things that couldn't be expressed in the dominant culture's approved forms. Grief, anger, joy that doesn't ask permission. The full spectrum of human experience pushed through a brass instrument by people who had been told, in various ways, that their experience wasn't legible or didn't matter or shouldn't be spoken. Lisa plays the saxophone in Springfield, which is to say she plays an instrument whose entire cultural tradition is built around giving voice to experience that conventional social structures suppress, in a town where conventional social structures suppress almost everything. The saxophone is not incidental to Lisa's character. It is her most accurate self-portrait. The show has given Lisa moments with the instrument that go beyond musical performance. There are episodes in which Lisa's playing is described as transcendent, episodes in which the music she produces moves other characters in ways they can't explain and don't have the vocabulary to articulate. She plays and something happens in the people listening that the people listening can't name. The music bypasses the town's elaborate suppression infrastructure and arrives somewhere in the listener that the town hasn't managed to seal off. This is what music is supposed to do. This is what Lisa's particular musicianship, developed in the specific environment of Springfield, with all of Springfield's particular repressions and denials and systematic indifference to truth, has equipped her to produce. She plays the feeling of living in Springfield to the people living in Springfield, and they are moved by it without understanding why, because the part of them that recognizes what she's playing is the part the town has never quite managed to silence. Lisa is 8 years old. She has been 8 years old for 36 years, and for all of that time she has been playing this music in this town. And the town has been moved by it in the moments of performance and has gone back to its baseline state in the moments after, and the music has changed nothing structurally, not a single thing about how Springfield operates, or who it serves, or what it suppresses. This is, in its way, the most accurate thing the show says about art and its relationship to the systems within which art is produced and consumed. The music is real. The emotion it produces is real. The change it fails to produce is also real. Art moves people, and the people, moved, return to the structures that required the art in the first place. Lisa plays, Springfield feels something. Springfield continues. She doesn't stop playing. This is the crucial thing about Lisa and the saxophone that makes her more than a portrait of frustrated idealism. She knows it doesn't change anything. She's been paying close enough attention to Springfield's dynamics for 8 years, which is to say for her entire remembered life, to understand that expression and change are not the same thing, that moving someone and moving something are different categories of event. She knows this, and she plays anyway. The saxophone isn't optimism. It's not a belief that the music will fix anything. It's the practice of honesty in a town built on denial, sustained not because it works, but because the alternative, silence, is a form of capitulation that Lisa, uniquely among Springfield's residents, has so far refused to make. She is the only person in Springfield who has seen the three-eyed fish and kept looking, who has heard about the radiation and asked the follow-up questions, who has noticed the pattern in what gets remembered and what gets forgotten and found the pattern troubling rather than convenient. She sees Springfield clearly. The saxophone is what she does with the clarity. The weight she carries isn't just the isolation of being the only person in a room who understands what's actually happening. It's the specific isolation of having that understanding in a body that isn't old enough to act on it, in a family that loves her but can't quite hear what she's saying, in a town that appreciates her music while ignoring her meaning. She is comprehensively right and comprehensively unheard, and she has been both of these things for 36 years without becoming either resigned or strategic in her silence the way her younger sister has. That's the weight, the continued choice to speak, to play, to insist on the honest version of things in a place that has organized itself around the dishonest version. Not because it works, because it's true. Lisa Simpson carries Springfield's conscience. Not because anyone asked her to, because no one else would. The specific music Lisa plays matters in ways that rarely get articulated in discussions of her character. Jazz, as a form, is built around the relationship between structure and deviation. The chord changes provide a framework. The improvisation is what the musician does within and against that framework. A jazz musician who only plays the changes is not really playing jazz. The form requires that the player engage with the structure, understand it deeply, and then find the spaces within it where something unrehearsed and personal can emerge. This is an extraordinarily accurate metaphor for Lisa's relationship with Springfield. Springfield has structures. It has rules, implicit and explicit, about what is to be said and what is not, what is to be acknowledged and what is to be looked past, what kinds of people get to speak and what kinds of people are supposed to listen. Lisa understands these structures better than almost anyone. She has spent her entire life studying them, cataloging them, being frustrated by them. She knows exactly where the rules are and exactly what they are meant to prevent. Her intelligence is her improvisation. It finds the spaces within Springfield's structures that the structures didn't anticipate. The moments where truth can be spoken because the framework's designers didn't think to close that particular opening. The questions that can be asked because no one thought to make them officially inappropriate. The observations that land, briefly, before the structure reconstitutes around them and the space closes again. She plays jazz. She always plays jazz. Even when she's not holding the saxophone. Every argument she makes, every question she asks, every time she refuses to accept the framework's determination of what is discussable and what is not, is an improvisation within a structure that doesn't want to accommodate her. And she's very good at it. Better than Springfield deserves. Better than anyone has ever adequately told her. The saxophone is the visible form of something she's doing constantly and invisibly, making music in the spaces between the rules, finding the honest note in the gap between what the town says and what the town is. The moments when Lisa stops playing, when the saxophone is silent, are as meaningful as the moments when it sounds. There are episodes in which Lisa loses access to the music, episodes in which the weight becomes temporarily heavier than the instrument can hold. The show treats these moments with genuine gravity. They are not comic. They're the show's acknowledgement that the thing Lisa does, the continued insistence on honesty in a community organized around dishonesty, the continued playing in a town that moves on each time the music stops, is costly. It requires something. And occasionally what it requires exceeds what she has to give at that particular moment. And the music goes quiet, and Springfield continues without it. And the silence is its own kind of commentary on what the town sounds like when the one person playing the honest note takes a breath. The music always comes back. But the silences are real. They're the show's record of what Lisa's insistence costs her, and the cost is paid over and over across 36 years of not being heard. The show has given Lisa, across 36 years, a recurring set of allies who see her clearly for a moment and then are removed from her orbit by the plot's requirements. Teachers who recognize her, peers who match her intellectually, adults who treat her as someone worth taking seriously. These relationships arrive and then the episode ends and they're gone, not because the character development they offered wasn't real, but because the show requires Lisa to remain who she is, which means requiring her to remain, to some extent, without sustained support from the people who would change her relationship to her own intelligence. Growth requires relationship. The development of a particular kind of intelligence requires sustained engagement with other minds that can meet it and push it forward. Lisa's encounters with these minds are episodic. They end with the episode. The growth they initiate doesn't have the continuity it would need to compound. She returns to being 8 and isolated with no one in her immediate environment who quite knows what to do with her. She keeps playing. She keeps asking. And the allies appear and disappear and appear again, and each time there's the brief possibility of something different, and each time one leaves the saxophone comes back out, and the music says what the absence of the ally leaves unsaid. Number. Section 9. Grandpa Simpson and the Buried History. Abe Simpson is a liar. This is a fact the show establishes in the Mother Simpson episode, when it's revealed that Abe told Homer his mother was dead and maintained that lie for Homer's entire childhood and most of his adult life. He showed Homer a fake grave. He constructed an entire false history of Homer's maternal loss, and he did it, the show implies, out of a combination of shame, self-protection, and a genuine if deeply misguided belief that this was the safer path. But the lie about Mona is not the only thing Abe has buried. It's not even the most significant. It's the one the show chose to excavate, but the architecture of concealment that Abe has built across his life is considerably larger than that single false grave. Abe is Springfield's connection to history. He remembers things. Not reliably, not consistently, not with the kind of linear coherence that makes historical testimony useful in a conventional sense. Abe's memory is a difficult place, full of contradictions and anachronisms and details that don't quite line up with each other or with the established timeline. He claims to have fought in several wars. He claims acquaintance with historical figures whose lives overlap in ways that require him to have been alive for longer than his stated age permits. He makes claims about the past that the show doesn't fully corroborate and never quite debunks. This should make Abe an unreliable witness. And the show does, frequently, treat his historical reminiscences as comedy, as the confused ramblings of an old man whose grip on the past has loosened. But there's a detail that the comedy consistently covers over. Abe is not confused, he's selective. The difference matters. A confused person doesn't know what they're concealing. A selective person does. And Abe Simpson, for all the show's depiction of his cognitive decline, demonstrates in key moments a precision of recall and a strategic clarity about what he reveals and what he doesn't that is inconsistent with genuine confusion. The deal he made with Burns is the clearest evidence of this. At some point in the past, Abe discovered something about Burns, something significant enough that Burns was willing to guarantee Homer's continued employment in exchange for Abe's silence. This is a deal that requires understanding what you possess and what it's worth. It requires strategic thinking. It requires the ability to negotiate with one of the most powerful men in Springfield from a position of sufficient leverage to extract a meaningful commitment. This is not a confused man's behavior. Abe made a deal with Burns when he was capable of understanding the terms. He maintained the deal through decades of apparent decline. He kept the secret about Homer's guaranteed employment even as he revealed or failed to conceal other things. The silence about Burns was deliberate and sustained in a way that his other confusions were not. This suggests that what Abe knows is larger than what the show has excavated, that the deal with Burns is a visible corner of a buried structure whose full dimensions the show has never mapped. That Abe Simpson's history in Springfield, his actual history rather than the version he's performed across 36 years of rambling reminiscence, contains more about how Springfield came to be what it is than any other character's history. Abe was there before Homer. He was there before the nuclear power plant dominated Springfield's skyline. He knew Springfield when it was something different, or at least something younger, something that hadn't yet become the fully formed contamination zone it would become. And he has been present for the transition, watching it happen, knowing what was happening, and choosing, for reasons the show has never fully elaborated, to remain silent about it. The show has provided fragments of this history across various episodes. In Boy Scouts and the Hood, in Grandpa's I Knew Dillinger episode, in the various war reminiscences that scatter across the series, pieces of Abe's actual past surface. They don't cohere into a complete picture. They weren't designed to. But the fragments suggest a person who has been in Springfield for a very long time and who has watched the town's particular pathologies develop from a perspective that nobody else in the current cast possesses. There's a theory about Abe that emerges from the Mother Simpson episode and that the show never pursues but that the narrative logic of what the episode reveals seems to support. Abe knew about Burns's biological weapons laboratory. He knew what Mona was planning to do, and he allowed it to happen. Not because he supported Mona's activism, but because he knew enough about Burns's operations, about the biological weapons facility in Springfield, about what Burns had been doing in the town Abe had lived in his whole life, to believe that Mona's intervention was justified. The show depicts Abe as a passive figure in the events that destroyed his marriage and cost his son his mother. He told Homer Mona was dead. He maintained the lie. He seems to have accepted, with a resignation that reads as either cowardice or wisdom depending on how you read it, the permanent consequence of what happened. But what if the resignation is neither of those things? What if Abe accepted the consequence because he understood what it cost him to accept it? He lost his wife because he couldn't protect her from Burns's reach. He lied to Homer because telling the truth would have required explaining a history of Burns's activities in Springfield that Abe, for reasons connected to his own complicity or knowledge, or simply his continued survival in Burns's orbit, couldn't risk explaining. The deal with Burns, the one that guaranteed Homer's employment, makes more sense in this context. Abe wasn't just extracting a benefit from Burns in exchange for silence. He was negotiating a form of protection for Homer in a situation where Homer's father could not provide protection in any other form. He couldn't give Homer his mother back. He couldn't undo what Burns had done to his family. The best he could do was ensure that Homer would have a job, that Homer would be materially provided for, that the destruction Burns had visited on the family would not be compounded by economic catastrophe. It's a terrible compensation. It's not even close to adequate, but it's what Abe could offer from inside the position he was in, knowing what he knew, having made the calculations about what telling the truth would cost. Abe sits in the retirement home and watches television and tells stories that the people around him can't fully follow and that they're not sure they believe. He's the oldest living witness to Springfield's history. He has more context than anyone else in the cast for understanding how the town became what it is. And he has spent decades choosing, carefully and deliberately, what to share and what to keep. The rambling is real. The confusion is real. Abe is old and his memory is genuinely fragile in ways that are neither strategic nor comfortable. But beneath the confusion, maintained through the decline with a discipline that the decline hasn't eroded, is the buried history of Springfield. The things that happened before the show began. The decisions that shape the world that Homer and Bart and Lisa and Maggie inhabit without knowing it. Abe knows where the bodies are. Metaphorically, possibly literally. He knows what the town was before it became what it is. He knows what Burns did and what it cost, and what was traded to keep the peace. And he's not telling. Not because he can't, because he's decided that the version of the past that everyone can live with is better than the version that's true. He made the same calculation that Springfield makes every time it resets. The lie is survivable. The truth might not be. Every generation in Springfield eventually makes this calculation. Every generation decides that the affordable fiction is worth the price of the buried history. And every generation buries a little more. Abe's generation buried the biological weapons. Homer's generation buried Mona's exile. Bart and Lisa's generation will bury something the show hasn't shown us yet. The sediment accumulates. Springfield's past gets thicker and less accessible with every decade that passes, and every truth that gets traded for a quieter present. Abe Simpson is the deepest layer, the one who knows what's at the bottom of the accumulation, and he's running out of time to tell it, or out of reasons to, or both. The retirement home doesn't get visitors often enough. And even when it does, the conversation moves to other things before it reaches the questions that would matter. There is a specific kind of silence that belongs to people who know a great deal and have decided, for reasons of their own, that they will share it only in fragments. Abe Simpson's silences are that kind. The rambling monologues are real. He does wander. He does repeat himself. He does lose the thread of what he was saying and pick up a different one that leads somewhere unexpected. But the wandering is not uniform. There are topics on which Abe is not confused. There are things he does not forget. And the pattern of what he remembers clearly versus what he claims not to remember at all is not random. Abe remembers the war with extraordinary specificity. Dates, locations, names of commanding officers, the layout of buildings he entered once in 1944. He can describe European geography from memory. He can recount tactical decisions and their consequences with the kind of precision that military historians spend careers trying to reconstruct from documents. The cognitive architecture required to store and retrieve this material is intact. Abe Simpson, when the subject is something he experienced before 1950, demonstrates recall that most people would envy. He does not remember, or claims not to remember, anything about Mona's activism. He cannot account for the years in which Homer was told his mother was dead. He is unclear on the details of the deal with Burns. He becomes vague precisely at the moments when clarity would be either useful or damaging. This is not the pattern of a degenerating memory. A degenerating memory loses recent events first and preserves older ones, yes. but it doesn't selectively lose the emotionally charged material from a specific period while preserving structurally similar material from an adjacent period. Abe's memory works fine for everything except the things he would prefer not to have to explain. That's not dementia, that's discretion. Abe Simpson is the keeper of Springfield's buried history. Not all of it. Not the institutional history of the town's relationship with the power plant or Burns's influence over local government. That history is kept elsewhere, or not kept at all, distributed across the collective, forgetting that the town has turned into a social practice. But the Simpson family's particular buried history, the deals and the lies and the absences and the rationalizations, that history is Abe's, and he has never let go of it. The deal with Burns is the clearest expression of this. Abe discovered something Burns had done, something bad enough to be actionable, and rather than acting on it, he turned it into a private agreement that guaranteed Homer a job for life. The pragmatic reading of this is that Abe chose a concrete benefit for his son over the abstract satisfaction of holding a powerful man accountable for something the powerful man would almost certainly have escaped accountability for. Anyway, Springfield's legal and political infrastructure was, as we've discussed, not well configured for holding Burns to account. Abe may have assessed the situation correctly and concluded that leverage was more useful than disclosure. But there's a cost to this choice that the show tracks across generations. Homer spends his adult life working for the man who destroyed his family and doesn't know why his job is secure when nothing else he does at the plant suggests it should be. He carries a protection he didn't ask for and doesn't understand, provided through an arrangement he was never told about, by a father who traded the truth for a guarantee that the truth was no longer necessary to know. Abe's love for Homer is not in question. The show establishes it clearly enough. But love expressed through the suppression of information that the person you love needs to understand their own life is a specific kind of love. The kind that prioritizes protection over honesty, the kind that makes decisions for the person it loves rather than equipping that person to make their own. Homer never got to decide whether he wanted to know. Abe decided for him, and the decision was made when Homer was a child, and it persisted through Homer's entire adult life. And it was never revisited because revisiting it would require Abe to explain a choice that, with the perspective of decades, might not look as clearly right as it did in the moment. There's one more layer to Abe's buried history that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Abe's own relationship with the truth about his wartime experience is complicated. The show depicts Abe as a veteran who is proud of his service but evasive about its specifics in ways that go beyond the normal reticence of his generation. He has referenced events and actions from the war that, if taken at face value, raise questions. He has implied involvement in things that the show treats as comic exaggeration but that, if real, would represent serious ethical complications in his personal history. Abe Simpson has been alive since before the Second World War. He has watched Springfield become what it is. He was present for the formation of the conditions that produced the town's current dysfunction. He knew Burns before Burns was the Burns of the present day. He made a deal with that Burns at a time when the deal seemed manageable. And now he is very old, and the world he helped shape by his choices, small and large, is the world his son and his grandchildren inhabit. The rambling is real. The confusion is real. But the silence at the center of the rambling, the still point around which the wandering orbits without ever quite arriving, is not confusion. It's a very old man who knows things and has decided, again and again across many decades, that knowing them alone is enough. Abe Simpson's relationship with other veterans in Springfield is worth a moment of attention because the show has occasionally depicted Abe in social contexts with other men his age, and the dynamics of those interactions reveal something about how he navigates the space between what he knows and what he says. Among his peers, the men who share his era and his general experience of the war and its aftermath, Abe is a specific social type. He tells stories. He performs the veteran identity with a particular kind of theatrical energy that functions, in part, as social currency in those contexts. The stories are real. The experiences they depict are real. But the telling has been refined over decades into something that is partly communication and partly performance. And the performance aspect serves a function that pure communication wouldn't. When Abe is performing, he's not being asked questions. The social role of the storyteller in a group of peers is partly to occupy the conversational space in a way that forecloses interrogation. You can't question a story mid-telling without being rude. You receive a story. You respond to a story. You don't interrupt a story to ask the teller what else he knows that he's not telling. This is, if you're paying attention to it, a very sophisticated social strategy for someone who is supposedly defined by his cognitive decline. Abe fills every available conversational space with anecdote and performance in contexts where his knowledge and his silences might otherwise invite scrutiny. He is, in this reading, not a confused old man rambling helplessly. He is a very experienced old man, deploying a very well-practiced technique for controlling what gets talked about and what doesn't. The buried history stays buried not because Abe forgot it. It stays buried because Abe has spent 70 years being very good at making sure nobody thinks to dig. One episode in the show's history gives Abe Simpson an uncharacteristic moment of directness that then, consistent with Springfield's memory problem, is never revisited. He sits with Homer and says, clearly and without the protective cover of a rambling anecdote, something that amounts to, "I know I wasn't what you needed. I know I didn't know how to be." He doesn't explain Mona. He doesn't explain the deal with Burns. He doesn't provide the structural accounting that Homer's understanding of his own life would require. But he says the thing that is most immediately and personally true, that he failed at fatherhood in a specific way that had specific consequences for a specific person. And Homer, whose cognitive architecture doesn't always allow him to hold this kind of emotional complexity for long, receives it, briefly. And then the episode moves on, and the acknowledgement joins everything else in Springfield's vast archive of true things that were said once and then forgotten. But it was said. It happened. It's in the record, for whoever is paying close enough attention to keep it there. There's a generation of Springfield that predates the show entirely, that existed before Homer was born, before the nuclear plant was built, before Burns arrived and established his dominion over the town's economic and physical landscape. Abe Simpson is the last living witness to that Springfield, to whatever the town was before it became what it is. And the show has given him no vocabulary for describing it. Not because the writers haven't thought about it, but because Abe himself has no vocabulary for it. The before and the after have collapsed into a single continuous present in which the plant has always been there, and Burns has always been the dominant force, and Homer has always worked where he works. This is the amnesia of the survivor. Not forgetting that things were different, exactly, but losing the felt sense of the difference, the lived experience of a before that stands in contrast to the after. Abe knows things were different. He can point to specific moments, but the difference doesn't feel like loss anymore. It feels like history. And history is different from loss, in the way that knowing something happened is different from remembering what it felt like. The before is gone. Abe carries the record of it without the feeling of it. And neither the record nor the absence of feeling is something he quite knows how to give to Homer. Number, Section 10. The Animals of Springfield. A hidden record. The Animals of Springfield have been keeping a record that nobody has read. This sounds strange. Animals don't keep records. They don't document. They don't accumulate evidence in forms that human beings can consult. But animals do something that functions as a record in an indirect sense. They reflect their environment in their biology. They express, in the particular forms their bodies take and the particular ways they behave, the conditions of the world they inhabit. The animals of Springfield are wrong. Not in every detail, not in obvious, dramatic, impossible ways that would demand attention, but in the accumulating, quiet, persistent ways that are characteristic of environmental damage, in the ways that a wildlife biologist would recognize immediately as the biological signature of a compromised ecosystem. Blinky is the most famous, the three-eyed fish pulled from a river near the nuclear power plant that became a brief national news story within the show's universe and then was forgotten when Burns successfully performed harmlessness on live television. Blinky is the clearest, most legible piece of biological evidence that the Springfield environment has produced. A visible, obvious, anatomically impossible mutation that carries a direct causal arrow back to the radiation source. And Springfield forgot Blinky. The town looked at a fish with 3 eyes, absorbed the implication for approximately 1 news cycle, and returned to its ordinary operations. But Blinky didn't go away. The three-eyed fish exists because the river contains something that produces three-eyed fish. That thing did not cease to exist because the news story faded. The conditions that produced Blinky continued producing similar effects in the river's ecosystem, in the fish and the insects and the amphibians and the microorganisms that the river supports, invisibly and continuously, long after the cameras left. The animals of Springfield are the town's environmental monitoring system. They're more sensitive to the conditions than the human residents are, because their lives are shorter, their reproduction cycles are faster, and the effects of environmental toxins can be observed across multiple generations in a matter of years rather than decades. If you want to know what a contaminated environment is doing to the life it contains, you start with the animals. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family's greyhound, has the same physical characteristics as the human residents of Springfield. The bulging eyes, the proportions that don't quite conform to the actual anatomy of the breed. The show attributes this to the art style, and that's the real explanation. But within the show's logic, the fact that the dog who lives in the Simpson household shares the visual markers of the household's human members is a detail that rewards attention. The dog was acquired in Springfield. He's lived in Springfield his entire life. He drinks the same water. He breathes the same air. He exists within the same contaminated ecosystem as the family that adopted him. And he looks, in the particular ways that the show makes visible, like them. Not exactly like them, but similar enough that the visual family resemblance the show creates between the Simpsons and their dog is less comic coincidence and more what you'd expect if the contamination is pervasive enough to affect every living system in the area rather than just the human ones. The birds of Springfield are a detail that the show has included in various episodes without ever drawing sustained attention to them. In episodes where the Springfield outdoors is depicted in detail, the wildlife visible in the background has a quality that's difficult to articulate but persistent once you start noticing it. The birds don't move quite like birds. Their vocalizations, in episodes where ambient sound design is careful, include notes that don't belong to any identifiable species. The small animals visible in parks and green spaces have proportions that, like the human residents in Santa's Little Helper, deviate slightly from their real-world counterparts. This is partly the art style. The Simpsons' visual vocabulary distorts everything it depicts, animals included, toward the particular aesthetic of the show's universe. But within that universe, the distortion is consistent and universal. Every living thing in Springfield is slightly wrong in the same direction. Not dramatically wrong, not obviously, impossible wrong. Just slightly, persistently, uniformly wrong. Uniformly. That's the key word. If the distortion were random, if different species showed different kinds of deviation, it would read as pure stylistic variation. But the wrongness has a consistent character. It goes in the same direction across species. It produces the same visual signatures regardless of which organism it's occurring in. The yellow skin and the four fingers and the bulging eyes and the improbable proportions are not isolated to the human residents. They're a pattern. And patterns in biology suggest a common cause. There's a moment in one Treehouse of Horror episode, during a segment that involves Homer in various horror movie scenarios, where the wildlife Springfield passes through reads with unusual clarity as the fauna of a contaminated zone. The animals aren't comic. They're not threatening in the way horror movie animals are threatening. They're simply there, in the background, looking as they look, with the particular wrongness that Springfield's entire biological community shares. The show didn't intend this as environmental commentary in that moment. It was reaching for horror movie atmosphere. But the horror movie atmosphere it produced is indistinguishable from the atmosphere of a genuine environmental horror story. Because Springfield's visual vocabulary, applied to a horror context without its usual comic overlay, reads exactly as it would if you were depicting the actual consequences of decades of nuclear contamination on a local ecosystem. There's a category of Springfield animal that the show has treated as pure background comedy, but that fits the contamination theory with unusual precision. The luminous rats. In one of the safety inspection episodes, the violations at the nuclear power plant include luminous rats running through the facility's interior. The show depicts this with its characteristic comic briskness. The rat is glowing. It's a violation. We move on. But bioluminescence in mammals is a real biological response to certain kinds of chemical exposure. Some of the processes by which organisms process and store certain compounds produce fluorescent byproducts that can make tissue glow under certain lighting conditions. The luminous rats of the nuclear plant are not impossible. They're the biological response that you'd expect from animals living inside a nuclear facility with 342 safety violations, feeding on whatever is available in that environment and accumulating whatever the environment contains. The rats glow because they're saturated. They're walking repositories of the same material that is, at slower concentrations, affecting the human population of Springfield. The rats just have it at a concentration that makes the effect visible. And then there's the matter of Santa's Little Helpers puppies. In the Season 2 episode Bart Gets a Dog, the subplot involves Santa's little helper fathering a litter of puppies. The puppies are used primarily as a comic device. Too many of them. Homer's exasperation, the need to find them homes. The episode treats them as a minor plot point in a story primarily about Bart's new dog. But the puppies are a second generation. They're the offspring of an animal who has been living in Springfield, exposed to Springfield's environment, for a period of time sufficient to produce offspring. And the puppies are, visually, consistent with their parent. The same proportions, the same characteristics. The characteristics are heritable. Whatever the environment has done to Santa's Little Helper's biology has been sufficiently integrated into his genetic expression that the next generation carries the markers too. This is how environmental contamination works in real ecosystems. The first generation shows symptoms. The second generation inherits them. By the third generation, the symptoms are so thoroughly integrated into the population's biology that they no longer read as symptoms. They read as the species' normal expression. The abnormal becomes the baseline. The damage becomes the definition of health. Springfield is somewhere in the second or third generation of this process. The children of the original exposed population are themselves already expressing the markers. Their children will carry those markers as inherited characteristics rather than as acquired ones. And at some point in the future, if the town persists without environmental remediation, there will be no one alive who remembers that the fish ever had two eyes or that the people were ever a color other than yellow. The animals know, not in the way that intelligent beings know things, but in the way that all biological systems know things, which is through the accumulated, embodied record of what they've been exposed to and what they've survived. The luminous rats are the most obvious evidence. Blinky is the most famous. Santa's Little Helper is the most intimate, but the whole ecosystem is speaking, in the biological language that ecosystems use, about what has been done to it and what is still being done. The message has been visible for 36 seasons. In every episode that includes wildlife, in every outdoor scene, in every animal that shares the visual vocabulary of a contaminated population. Nobody in Springfield reads the message. Nobody reads it because the reading would require acknowledging what it says, and acknowledging what it says would require doing something about it, and doing something about it would require confronting the source of the contamination, and confronting the source of the contamination would require confronting Burns, and confronting Burns would require the kind of collective resolve that the contamination itself has made impossible. The animals are the most honest things in Springfield. They have no access to the denial mechanism that the human residents employ. They can't vote to keep the lie. They can't choose to forget what the water tastes like. They just glow. They just carry their three eyes. They just pass their markers to the next generation. And Springfield watches them and sees nothing. Domesticates them. Laughs at them. Keeps the dog. The record accumulates. Unread but preserved. The ecological record of a contaminated environment is written in its wildlife before it's written anywhere else. Animals don't rationalize. They don't normalize their own symptoms. They don't participate in the social agreement that certain things are not to be noticed or mentioned. They just live in the environment and express what the environment does to them, without politics, without language, without the particular human capacity for looking directly at evidence of harm and deciding to look slightly to the left of it instead. Springfield's animals are a more honest record of what the power plant has done to the town than anything the human residents have been able to produce. Blinky is the obvious starting point, but the full implications of Blinky's existence are rarely followed to their conclusion. A three-eyed fish in a river near a nuclear power plant is not a curiosity. It's a sentinel event. In environmental monitoring, a sentinel event is an unexpected occurrence that signals something significant about the underlying conditions of an environment. A sentinel species is a species particularly sensitive to environmental changes whose health status provides early warning of threats that may eventually affect other species, including humans. Blinky is a sentinel event. The mutation he displays is a direct, visible, measurable consequence of radioactive contamination in Springfield's water supply. And the show depicts the town's response to Blinky, the gubernatorial campaign's use of him as evidence, Burns's forced fish eating on television, the subsequent return to normalcy, as a complete social processing of the sentinel event that results in no change to the underlying conditions and no investigation of what the underlying conditions have done to other organisms in the same environment. Blinky isn't alone. He's the most visible mutation, the most narratively prominent, but the show's Springfield contains a wildlife ecology that is, when examined comprehensively, a catalog of documented environmental effects from long-term radioactive contamination. The luminous rats in the power plant's basement, rodents whose biology has been sufficiently altered by radiation exposure that they emit visible light. These are not background characters. These are organisms whose bioluminescence represents a measurable biological alteration caused by a measurable environmental cause. They live in the walls of the facility that produced their condition, visible evidence of what the facility produces, ignored by the facility's management for the same reasons that the management ignores everything else that the facility produces. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family greyhound, shares with his owners a set of physical characteristics that deviate from normal canine anatomy in ways consistent with the physical deviations displayed by Springfield's human residents. The eyes that are disproportionately large, the proportional structure that, while recognizably canine, reflects the same distortions that mark every organism raised inside Springfield's contamination zone. A dog who has lived in a Springfield household since the household began, eating Springfield food, drinking Springfield water, breathing Springfield air, shares the physical signature of Springfield's environmental legacy. He's not a mutation in the dramatic sense. He's simply an organism that has been shaped, over years, by the environment in which it exists. The show has also depicted other animal anomalies that receive even less attention than Blinky. Birds that behave strangely near the power plant. Fish catches in the river that produce organisms that experienced fishermen don't recognize. Insects in unusual configurations in the areas closest to the facility. These are background details, pieces of set dressing, not intended by the writers as environmental commentary any more than the four fingers are intended as biological commentary. They're visual shorthand for the quirky, slightly off-kilter quality of Springfield's world. But they accumulate, taken together, across 36 years of episodes set in a consistent geographic environment around a consistently malfunctioning nuclear facility. They form something that resembles a longitudinal environmental study. An accidental record of what happens to an ecosystem when the thing contaminating it is never addressed, and the organisms that could most usefully act on the evidence of contamination have made a collective decision not to look directly at it. The Springfield River is the central fact of this ecological record. It receives the plant's runoff. It carries the contamination through the town's watershed. It feeds the fish that the town's residents catch and eat. The three-eyed fish come from this river, which means they were living in water that was swimming with whatever produced a third eye, and the town's residents have been drinking water from this watershed and fishing in this watershed and giving that water to their children for the entire duration of the plant's operation. Blinky survived. Blinky's survival was the joke. The underlying question, the one the joke replaced, was what the same water was doing to the organisms that didn't develop an extra eye, but were developing other things instead. Things less visible, things you couldn't hold up to a camera and photograph as evidence, things you'd need a long-term epidemiological study to detect, and a functional environmental regulatory system to act on. Springfield's animals are trying to tell the story that Springfield's people have agreed not to hear. The fish have eyes. The rats have light. The dog looks like his owners. And the town looks at all of it and sees its pets and its fishing spots and its quirky local color, and the ecological record accumulates in the river and in the walls and in the biology of every organism that has spent its life inside the contamination zone, waiting for someone to read it. There's one animal in Springfield's ecological catalog that operates differently from the others, and its difference is instructive. The cat, Snowball, in her various iterations, is the Simpson family's other pet alongside Santa's little helper. Snowball has died multiple times and been replaced, each replacement introduced to the family as the same cat through a process of nominative convenience rather than genuine continuity. The family knows the cat has changed. On some level, they know. The specific details of the cat's physical appearance have changed between iterations in ways that are difficult to ignore. But the name persists. The category persists. Snowball is Snowball. The emotional role the cat fills in the household is filled by whatever cat is currently filling it, and the name and the role create continuity of a kind that the actual biology does not support. This is, in miniature, the way Springfield handles the continuity problem more broadly. The organism is different. The name is the same. The function is the same. The fiction of persistence is maintained by the social infrastructure of naming and role assignment rather than by any actual continuity of the individual. Springfield has done this with people too. The Principal Skinner episode is the most dramatic instance, but there are subtler versions throughout the show's history. Characters who are nominally the same character across decades but whose histories and personalities and relationships have been quietly revised to fit the needs of different episodes. The name and the role create the fiction of continuity. The actual content of the character is whatever the current episode requires. The cats are the honest version of this. Springfield doesn't pretend the cats are immortal. It just keeps the name, keeps the role, and tacitly agrees not to make the discontinuity the focus of anyone's sustained attention. In this one small area, the town's approach to its ecological record is identical to its approach to everything else. Names persist, roles persist, the underlying reality turns over quietly, and the social fiction holds. The three-eyed fish has one property that the show depicts and then largely abandons as a comedic beat, but which is worth retrieving. When the gubernatorial campaign tried to use Blinky as evidence of environmental contamination, Burns was forced to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate its safety. He ate it, he smiled, he appeared to experience no ill effects. The town was satisfied and the campaign's argument was neutralized. But the episode also shows the reaction shot of Burns's aide after Burns eats the fish, a barely contained horror at what his employer has just consumed. The fish, which mutated from the plant's runoff, was eaten by the man who runs the plant. The contamination completes a loop in that moment. The substance that the plant produced, that entered the ecosystem and expressed itself in the fish, was ingested by the man responsible for the substance entering the ecosystem. It's a quiet, grotesque. It's also, in its small way, the most direct depiction in the show's history of what it looks like when the person responsible for an environmental effect is finally, briefly, subject to it themselves. There is, finally, something to be said about the show's treatment of the Springfield environment that doesn't fit neatly into the contamination narrative. The show also depicts Springfield as beautiful, not beautiful in spite of the contamination, or beautiful in a way that the contamination undermines, but genuinely and straightforwardly beautiful in the specific way that familiar places are beautiful to the people who grew up in them. The river, with its three-eyed fish and its radioactive runoff, is also a river where characters fish and watch sunsets and have the kinds of slow, contemplative moments that rivers are for. The hills outside town, where the radiation levels are presumably highest and the visible mutations most pronounced in the local wildlife, are also the hills where characters go when they need to think, where Homer has his most inadvertent encounters with something like peace. Springfield is contaminated, and Springfield is home. The two things are not alternatives. They coexist in the way that all real places contain both beauty and damage. The people who live in contaminated communities don't experience their homes as contamination zones. They experience them as home, with all the attachment and the particular vision of the beloved that home produces. The contamination is there, the love is there, and the love doesn't cancel the contamination, and the contamination doesn't cancel the love. Both are real. The river is poisoned, and it's beautiful, and it's both of these things to the same people at the same time. Number. Section 11. The memory problem: why Springfield forgets everything. There's a specific kind of silence that follows a disaster in Springfield. Not the stunned silence of genuine shock, not the processing silence of people working through something they've just experienced. A particular, characteristically Springfield silence in which the absence of acknowledgement is itself the acknowledgement. The thing happened. Everyone knows the thing happened. And then, by some unspoken collective agreement, the thing is placed in a category labeled no longer applicable, and ordinary life resumes around the gap where the thing happened, as if the gap were always part of the landscape. The reset. The show's most discussed, most debated, most analyzed structural characteristic. Between almost every episode, the consequences of the previous episode dissolve. The damage is repaired. The learning is unrelearned. The characters return to their baseline positions and orientations, and the next story begins from approximately the same place the previous one started. This is standard sitcom structure. The Simpsons didn't invent it. Every sitcom operates on some version of this principle. The reset is what makes the genre possible. Without it, characters would accumulate consequences until the weight of them made the show something other than a comedy. But The Simpsons has been running long enough, and has depicted events dramatic enough, that the reset has become increasingly visible as a mechanism rather than as a natural feature of the show's world. When a town is sealed under a glass dome by the federal government, and this is not subsequently the defining fact of that town's existence, the reset is no longer invisible. When a man discovers that his employer is the person who destroyed his family, and this discovery produces no change in their relationship by the following episode, the reset is doing work that goes beyond the demands of episodic television. The memory problem in Springfield isn't just a structural convenience for the writers. Within the show's own logic, it's a symptom. And like the yellow skin and the four fingers and the luminous rats, the memory problem is something the show depicts consistently and never adequately explains. Let's be specific about what Springfield forgets and how. Homer has worked for Burns for his entire adult life. In the season that reveals Burns destroyed his family by driving Mona into exile, Homer learns this. He experiences the shock of the connection. The episode depicts his emotional response with a sincerity that the show reserves for its most serious material. And then, in subsequent episodes, Homer works for Burns as if nothing happened. He accepts his paycheck. He endures Burns' failure to remember his name. He sits in Section 7G and eats his donut and misses his meltdown warnings. The connection that should have changed everything changed nothing. Not because Homer made a conscious decision to compartmentalize or to prioritize financial necessity over emotional response, but because the connection simply didn't persist. It dissolved between the end of the episode and the beginning of the next one, the way a dream dissolves in the time between sleep and waking. The coma theory offers one explanation for this. If Homer is dreaming, if the show's post-season 4 episodes are the product of an unconscious mind, then memory between episodes is not a feature of the narrative's architecture. Dreams don't have persistent memory in the way that waking life does. Each dream begins approximately fresh. The emotional residue of previous dreams persists only as vague affect, not as explicit recalled content. Homer's inability to remember the connection between Burns and Mona's exile is consistent with the way dream state memory functions. The radiation theory offers a different explanation. Certain kinds of radiation exposure can affect the hippocampus, the brain region most critically involved in the consolidation of new memories. The conversion of short-term experience into long-term memory is an active biological process that requires specific neurological infrastructure. If that infrastructure is damaged or compromised by chronic radiation exposure, the consolidation process may be impaired. Experiences are processed in the moment, but not stored in the form of accessible long-term memories. Each day begins without the accumulated learning of the previous one. This would explain not just Homer's inability to remember the Burns-Mona connection. It would explain the entire pattern of Springfield's collective amnesia. A population whose memory consolidation is chronically impaired by environmental toxins would be a population that experiences events without being changed by them. That generates no durable learning from catastrophe. That resets, not because it chooses to, but because the biological mechanism for not resetting has been damaged. The third explanation, the one the Principal and the Pauper episode makes explicit in that one extraordinary moment of transparency, is social. Springfield forgets because forgetting is the town's chosen response to anything that would require it to change. The vote to erase the truth about Skinner's identity is the only time the show depicts this mechanism overtly. But the mechanism operates in every episode. The vote happens every week. It's just invisible most of the time. These three explanations are not mutually exclusive. They may all be partially true simultaneously. Springfield's memory problem may be a combination of neurological impairment produced by radiation exposure, structural social suppression produced by community dynamics, and the particular unreliability of a dream state narrative in which the dreaming mind cannot hold consistent memories across what it experiences as time. Whatever the cause, the effect is consistent. Springfield is a town that cannot learn from what happens to it. Events occur, consequences are briefly present, and then the consequences are not present, and the town continues. This has a specific implication that the show has never drawn out explicitly. If Springfield cannot learn from its experiences, then Springfield cannot protect itself from their repetition. The disasters that have befallen the town across 36 seasons aren't simply discrete catastrophes that the reset mechanism erases. They're the same catastrophe, in different forms, occurring repeatedly because the structural conditions that produce the catastrophe are never addressed. Burns continues operating the unsafe plant because the population cannot remember, in any accumulated, actionable way, what the plant has done to them. The safety violations persist because the civic response to the violations cannot be sustained long enough to produce remediation. The economic dependency persists because the experience of precarity that reveals the dependency is not retained long enough to motivate the organizing response that precarity typically produces. Springfield is trapped in a loop not because of a single dramatic mechanism, but because of the absence of one. The absence of memory, the absence of learning, the absence of the accumulated experience that allows communities over time to adapt and protect themselves from the forces that damage them. The show has been running this loop for 36 years. The same forms keep appearing, the same responses keep failing, the same reset keeps firing. And Springfield keeps waking up, episode after episode, having forgotten what it needs to remember to avoid waking up in the same position again. The most poignant version of this memory problem is not the dramatic one, not the erased consequences of major catastrophes. It's the quiet domestic version. The version in which Homer tells Marge something true about himself, something vulnerable and honest and real, and then in the next episode doesn't quite remember having said it, in which Bart and Lisa have a moment of genuine sibling connection that the next episode's dynamics don't reflect, in which the characters reach toward each other in ways that should matter and then return to their baseline positions as if the reaching didn't happen. The things that should accumulate, the moments of genuine human connection that should build into the kind of deepening relationship that long acquaintance produces, don't accumulate either. The reset applies to warmth as much as to catastrophe. Springfield can't learn from what damages it, but it also can't quite build on what heals it. It just continues. Episode after episode. The same loop, the same town, the same silence where the memory should be. The mechanism of forgetting in Springfield is worth examining at the granular level, because the show has depicted it often enough that a pattern emerges. The forgetting doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't arrive as a collective decision, a visible moment in which the community chooses to let something go. It happens in layers, the way sediment accumulates. The first layer is the immediate response, shock, discussion, the apparent processing of whatever has happened. The second layer is the normalization phase, in which the extraordinary event begins to be referenced less frequently and treated as something that happened rather than something that is happening. The third layer is the integration phase, in which the event is absorbed into the town's general atmosphere as background rather than foreground. No longer actively discussed but present in the way that old pain is present, below the surface, shaping behavior without being explicitly invoked. The fourth layer is the erasure proper, in which the event falls below the threshold of active memory and becomes, in practice, as if it never occurred. This four-stage process is not invented by The Simpsons. It is the standard social mechanism by which communities process traumatic or destabilizing events. In normal communities, the process might take years or decades, and the erasure is never quite complete. Traces remain. The event shows up in policy, in architecture, in cultural practice, in the specific ways that communities organize their responses to recurring situations. In Springfield, the process takes approximately one episode. This compression is the show's most radical departure from realistic social dynamics. The speed at which Springfield moves from shock to erasure has always been treated as a consequence of the episodic format, as a practical storytelling choice driven by the need to reset the premise for each week's story. This is, again, the real explanation. The writers need the slate clean for the next episode. But within Springfield's universe, the speed of the forgetting is itself data. If a community forgets at normal speed, the forgetting is social. It requires time and repetition, and the gradual accumulation of distance between the event and the present. If a community forgets at Springfield's speed, the forgetting requires something more active. Something that either impairs the neurological capacity for sustained recall or that provides such powerful social incentive to forget that the forgetting becomes effectively instantaneous. The radiation theory provides the neurological explanation. The hippocampus, the brain structure most centrally involved in the formation of new long-term memories, is particularly sensitive to radiation. Chronic low-level radiation exposure can impair hippocampal function in ways that reduce the efficiency of memory consolidation. Events experienced during or after significant radiation exposure may be processed less effectively than events processed before the exposure, or by a brain not subject to the same environmental stressors. If Springfield's residents have been living under chronic low-level radiation exposure for generations, their hippocampal function may be collectively impaired in a way that makes sustained recall of traumatic events structurally difficult. The forgetting isn't chosen. It's the physiological consequence of the same mechanism that's doing everything else to Springfield's biology. The social incentive explanation, derived from the principal and the pauper reading, is complementary rather than contradictory. Even if the neurological impairment makes forgetting easier, the social incentive makes it safer. Springfield has demonstrated, across multiple episodes, that the consequences of insisting on remembered truths in this community are severe. The real Seymour Skinner was exiled. Mona Simpson was driven underground. Characters who persist in inconvenient memories find themselves marginalized, dismissed, or removed from the social structure that makes ordinary life in Springfield possible. The community has created a social environment in which the cost of memory is high and the reward for forgetting is membership in good standing. So the forgetting is overdetermined. The biology makes it easy. The social structure makes it rewarding. And the result is a community with what might be called motivated amnesia, a population whose inability to sustain uncomfortable memories is both a symptom of what's been done to them and a choice they continuously, if unconsciously, remake in every interaction they have with each other. The real tragedy of Springfield's memory problem is not that the town forgets its disasters, it's that the town forgets its warmth with the same efficiency. The moments of genuine connection, the instances of real kindness between characters, the episodes that end with something true and good having happened between people who genuinely love each other, these don't accumulate either. They don't build. The growth that should follow from a meaningful experience, the changed relationship, the deepened understanding, the behavior altered by what was learned, doesn't persist either. Homer and Marge have their relationship repaired in 100 different episodes. The repair doesn't compound. It doesn't make the next episode's equivalent crisis easier to navigate because the accumulated evidence of their resilience hasn't been retained. Each crisis is faced essentially fresh, without the portfolio of resolved crises that a real marriage of this duration would provide. The love is real. The forgetting of what the love has survived is equally real, and the result is a marriage that stays in the same place forever, not because it isn't worth anything, but because neither party can hold on to the evidence of what it's worth. The memory problem isn't just a mechanism for resetting the premise. It's the condition that keeps Springfield from becoming anything other than what it is. Memory is the mechanism of growth. Without the ability to retain and integrate experience, growth is impossible. Springfield is frozen not because it can't experience things. It experiences extraordinary things at an extraordinary rate, but because the experience doesn't accumulate. It passes through and is gone. And the town wakes up the next week exactly where it was, ready to be surprised by the same things again, to make the same mistakes, to reach the same epiphanies that will be gone by morning. The memory problem is Springfield's most fundamental feature, more fundamental than the radiation, more fundamental than Burns's influence, more fundamental than the collective denial. Those are causes and mechanisms. The memory problem is the result. The town that nothing sticks to. The community that experiences everything and learns nothing. The place where even the love, which is real, doesn't build toward anything because the architecture required for building, the accumulated record of what was and what worked and what mattered, has been washed away by water that has been carrying something it shouldn't for longer than anyone can clearly remember. The forgetting has a specific texture in episodes focused on Homer that is worth noting. Homer's memory functions differently from the forgetting that the town does collectively. The collective forgetting is, as we've established, overdetermined by both biology and social incentive. Homer's individual forgetting has an additional dimension. Homer forgets things that hurt. Not always, not completely, but there is a pattern in what persists in Homer's memory and what doesn't that suggests his forgetting is, at least partly, a protective mechanism operating below the level of conscious choice. The clearest evidence of this is his mother. Homer's memory of Mona Simpson, for the years in which he believed her to be dead, was organized around the fact of loss rather than the content of the person. He knew she was gone. He couldn't remember her clearly. The specific memories, the particular interactions, the texture of her presence in his early childhood, had become blurred in a way that the show depicts as entirely plausible. This is consistent with what we know about traumatic loss and childhood memory. A young child who loses a parent and is given no adequate framework for processing the loss will often experience the memory of the parent as inaccessible. The grief is present, but the person becomes difficult to hold clearly in the mind, because holding the person clearly in the mind also means holding the loss clearly, and the developing child's psychology may not have the resources to do that without the structural support that was absent. Homer's memory of his mother was protected by his forgetting of her. He couldn't quite recall her because clearly recalling her would mean clearly experiencing the loss of her, and the loss of her, unprocessed and unexplained and attributed by Abe's lie to natural death, was not something Homer's cognitive architecture could afford to hold in high resolution. This means that when Mona returns in season 7, Homer is meeting her for the first time in a meaningful sense. The mother he meets is not the mother he remembers because the mother he remembers is barely there. The relationship they build in their brief reunion episodes is not a reconnection. It's a first connection, built in the shadow of all the time the connection was prevented. And when Mona dies, Homer is experiencing the loss of someone he had only just begun to know. The grief is for the relationship he finally got, and for the relationship he never had, and for the 30 years between them, and for the mother he spent his whole childhood not quite being able to remember. The forgetting, which protected him for decades, couldn't protect him from that. The relationship between Springfield's memory problem and its relationship to joy is something the show has explored without explicitly naming. The town forgets its disasters, but it also, in the same reset, forgets its celebrations. The moments of genuine communal warmth, the episodes that end with Springfield having done something collectively good, a neighbor helped, a crisis resolved through cooperation, a difference bridged by the particular human capacity for solidarity that emerges sometimes even in deeply dysfunctional communities. These don't accumulate either. Springfield can't build a tradition of caring for each other because the caring, like the disaster, is gone by morning. The town starts each week without the evidence of what it's capable of when it tries. This is, possibly, the most quietly devastating consequence of the memory problem. The disasters leaving no scar is terrible. The kindnesses leaving no foundation is something else. A community that forgets its best impulses as thoroughly as its worst can never build from either. It is perpetually new to itself, perpetually without the resource of its own history, perpetually having to rediscover both the depths it can sink to and the heights it can reach, every single week, from scratch. The memory problem has one more dimension that connects it to the show's relationship with its own audience. The show relies on the audience remembering things that Springfield forgets. We carry the continuity. We remember Maggie shooting Burns. We remember Mona's activism. We remember the real Seymour Skinner tied to a train car. We remember Blinky. The audience is the archive that Springfield cannot be. And in this sense, the show has created a split structure, a fictional community that cannot hold its own history, and a real community of viewers that holds it on the fictional community's behalf. This is an unusual relationship between a show and its audience. Normally, the audience witnesses the story and the story contains itself. Here, the story has offloaded its continuity onto the people watching it. The show's history exists in the audience's memory rather than in Springfield's, which means that 36 years of buried truths and forgotten catastrophes and suppressed revelations and character developments that should have compounded but didn't are being held, carefully, by the people who watch them happen. We are Springfield's hippocampus. We are the part of the town that can remember. And the town doesn't know we're here, keeping the record, carrying the continuity it has been unable to maintain for itself. Every theory in this video is possible because viewers remembered what Springfield forgot. We are the archive. We are the record. We are the thing that makes Springfield's history legible even to Springfield itself. Number section 12. What Springfield has always been trying to tell you. 36 years is a very long time to tell the same story. Not the same story in the sense of identical plots and repeated characters and recycled jokes. The Simpsons has been remarkably inventive across its run, generating 800 episodes of content that, despite the occasional repetition, represents an extraordinary sustained creative effort. The same story in a different sense. The story underneath the stories. The one that doesn't have a title card or a log line or a writing credit. The story that the show has been assembling, detail by detail and season by season, in the space between the jokes and the plots and the character moments. This story is not a mystery in the conventional sense. It's not structured with clues and red herrings and a resolution designed to satisfy the itch of solved puzzles. It's the kind of story that emerges from the accumulated evidence of a place examined over time, the way the history of a building reveals itself in layers of paint and changes of use, and the particular way certain rooms hold light in the late afternoon. Springfield tells this story in biology, in the yellow skin and the four fingers and the luminous rats and the three-eyed fish, in the bodies of people who have been slowly, quietly, persistently altered by the environment they inhabit without knowing the alteration is occurring. Springfield tells this story in economics, in the careful calibration of wage and cost that keeps a workforce dependent and local and unable to question the terms of its employment, in the poor door that separates the people who benefit from the town's primary industry from the people who pay for those benefits with their health and their potential. Springfield tells this story in memory, in the resets and the erasures and the collective agreements not to acknowledge what the previous episode contained. In the way the town wakes up each day, slightly emptier of the accumulated experience that should be shaping it, and slightly more thoroughly its own permanent present. Springfield tells this story in its children, in Bart, whose particular kind of intelligence has been systematically mismatched to every structure designed to develop it, in Lisa, who carries the weight of clear seeing in a community organized around not seeing and hasn't stopped carrying it for 36 years, in Maggie, who has decided that visibility is a liability and whose decision may be the wisest thing any Simpson has ever done. And Springfield tells this story in its adults, in Homer, who is what he is not because of personal failure but because of the convergence of forces, biological and economic and psychological, that have produced him, in Marge, who maintains the stability that those forces make necessary at a cost the show depicts but never quite names, in Abe, who knows the buried history and keeps it buried because the truth of it would cost more than the lie. The theories we've explored across this script aren't 10 separate explanations for what's wrong with Springfield. They're 10 different angles on the same thing, 10 different entry points into a single observation that the show has been making from the beginning. Springfield is what happens when the systems that are supposed to protect and support and develop human beings are organized, instead, around the interests of the people who benefit most from the systems. When the economic system serves capital rather than labor, when the political system serves wealth rather than citizenship, when the educational system serves the status quo rather than the children entrusted to it, when the environmental regulatory system serves industry rather than the community it's supposed to protect. The show made this observation in 1989 and has been repeating it, in every form the sitcom format permits, for every subsequent year. It used a cartoon family and a cartoon town to make legible something that is very difficult to make legible in more realistic forms, because realistic forms don't have the compression that the cartoon permits. The cartoon can show you the three-eyed fish, and the luminous rats, and the cracked cooling towers, and Burns's weekly radiation treatments, and Homer's 55 IQ all in the same frame of reference, without the distancing effect that realism would require. And then the show puts a laugh track under it. Not literally, The Simpsons doesn't use a laugh track, but it puts comedy under it. It makes everything funny. It gives you Homer's dough, and Bart's a caramba, and Burns's excellent and Maggie's pacifier, and a family portrait that is, despite everything, recognizably loving, despite everything, which is perhaps the most accurate thing the show says about the thing it's depicting. Despite everything, the family loves each other. This is not incidental. It's the whole point. The love is real, and it operates inside a context that is trying to destroy everything it's attached to. The love is not enough to fix Springfield. It's not enough to undo the radiation damage, or the economic capture, or the memory erasure, or the institutional failures. But it persists anyway. It shows up, every episode, amid everything that's trying to extinguish it. That's the story Springfield has been telling. Not the story about whether the fish have 2 eyes or 3. Not the story about whether Homer is in a coma or whether Maggie really pulled the trigger. Those are the surfaces of the story. The entry points into something deeper. The deeper story is about what love looks like inside a system that doesn't care about it. About what a family does when the town they live in, the economy they depend on, the institutions they trust, have all been organized around their exploitation rather than their flourishing. About how human beings persist, with their warmth and their humor and their capacity for attachment and their occasional, improbable moments of genuine grace, inside conditions designed to prevent exactly that kind of persistence. Homer falls down and gets back up. Marge worries and holds things together. Bart rebels against every structure that contains him. Lisa asks the questions nobody wants answered. Maggie watches and waits. The loop continues. Springfield wakes up tomorrow without the memory of today. The fish still has 3 eyes. The plant is still leaking. Burns is still alive. And on Evergreen Terrace, in a house that shouldn't be affordable on the salary that pays for it, in a town that can't quite be located on any map, the family that shouldn't quite be intact given everything that's been thrown at it is intact anyway. Sitting on the couch. The television on. The couch gag playing. The theme music beginning. Everything wrong. Everything somehow still here. That's Springfield. That's the story it has always been telling, in yellow and in silence, and in the particular quality of light on a Sunday evening, when the most famous family in the history of American television sits down together in the town that is trying to swallow them, and survives another episode. Get some rest. The town will be here when you wake up. It always is. That's the whole point. It always is. The theories we've walked through tonight are not really about what The Simpsons means. They're about what Springfield is. And the answer, approached from 12 different directions across 12 different sections of this script, is always some variation of the same thing. Springfield is a place that contains, within its ordinary surface, the full weight of what happens when systems designed to serve people are captured, over time, by the interests of the powerful. When the institution meant to protect becomes the mechanism of exposure. When the community meant to support becomes the structure of isolation. When the family meant to nurture becomes the container of inherited damage. When the town meant to be home becomes the place you can't quite escape and can't quite see clearly. This is not unique to Springfield. This is the condition of most actual communities that have existed inside most actual economies throughout most of recorded history. The Springfield nuclear plant isn't unique. The company towns it represents were real and are real. The Burns who profit from keeping their workers dependent and cognitively manageable are real and have always been real. The Marges who hold things together at personal cost, the Lisas who see clearly and are not heard, the Barts whose potential is ground down by institutions that don't have the capacity to meet them where they are, the Grandpas who made their deals and can't entirely undo them, the Neds whose goodness is used by a system indifferent to goodness. These people are everywhere. They are in every city and every suburb and every rural community where a single employer dominates and a single set of economic interests shapes what is possible and what is permissible and what is the price of staying and what is the cost of speaking. The Simpsons made all of this funny. For 36 years and nearly 800 episodes, it made the weight bearable by making it laughable, which is one of the oldest human strategies for surviving unbearable things. You laugh at the thing that is too large to confront directly. You make the monster ridiculous so that the fear of it becomes manageable. You find the absurdity in the horror and you hold the absurdity up between yourself and the horror and you breathe. The show understood this about its audience from the beginning. The Simpsons debuted in the last year of the 1980s, at the end of a decade that had produced extraordinary concentrations of wealth and significant erosion of the economic conditions that had, for a few decades, allowed something like genuine middle-class stability to exist in America. The Simpson family's economic precariousness, their dependence on Homer's single income from a dangerous job at a facility run by a man who doesn't know his name, was immediately recognizable to an enormous portion of the audience. Not as satire, as description. The show has outlasted every economic shift since then. It has absorbed the 90s and the zeros and the 10s and the 20s, and it has kept Homer at the plant and Burns at the top and the family on the couch and the town in the same place, and through all of it, the basic structure of the joke has remained recognizable. Because the basic structure of the joke is the basic structure of a great deal of American economic life, and that structure has not changed in any fundamental way across the decades the show has been running. If anything, it has intensified. The Burns to Homer ratio, if you want to describe it that way, has shifted. The power plant has become more dominant, and the safety inspector's position has become more precarious. And the show has stayed accurate to its satirical subject precisely because it stayed frozen. The floating timeline is not just a production convenience. It is the show's thesis statement about the thing it has been depicting for 36 years. Nothing changes in Springfield because nothing changes in the conditions Springfield depicts. The loop is not laziness. The loop is the point. And here, at the end of all of it, is what makes Springfield genuinely haunting beneath the comedy. The show doesn't offer a solution. It doesn't posit a moment at which the people of Springfield wake up, understand what's been done to them, and organize a meaningful response. Burns is never held accountable in any lasting way. The plant is never cleaned up. The water supply is never remediated. Homer never connects the dots between his employer and his missing mother and the fog in his brain. Lisa never gets the hearing she deserves. Bart never gets the support he needed. Marge never gets the conversation she's been not quite having for 36 years. The show ends every episode where it began. The couch, the family, the loop. You might read this as despair, as a vision of structural inescapability that forecloses the possibility of genuine change. And it would be dishonest to pretend that this reading is entirely wrong. The show has not been optimistic about the capacity of Springfield's residents to transform their situation. The radiation has done what the radiation has done. The deal with Burns is what it is. The memory problem ensures that even the episodes that end with something genuinely good don't build toward anything. But there's a second reading, and it's the one that explains why the show has produced genuine emotional resonance for 36 years rather than only producing satirical distance. The family is still there. After everything. After the radiation and the deals and the suppressed truths and the forgotten catastrophes and the institutional failures and the economic capture and the memory problem and all of it, the family is still on the couch. Homer still comes home. Marge still holds the structure. Bart still reaches, in his sideways guarded way, for connection. Lisa still plays. Maggie still watches. The love in that family is real. The show has never been able to depict it as anything other than real, even in its most cynical episodes, even when the comedy is darkest and the structural critique most explicit. Homer loves Marge. He loves his children. He is, in his damaged, cognitively impaired, systemically exploited, crayon-brained way, trying. The trying is genuine. The love is genuine. And the fact that both of these things are true simultaneously, that Homer is the product of a system designed to break him, and that Homer also genuinely loves his family, and that these two facts coexist without canceling each other out, is the most honest thing the show has ever said about people. We are all, to varying degrees, the products of systems that have shaped us in ways we didn't choose and can't fully see. We all carry inherited damage and environmental effects and the consequences of deals we didn't make and truths we weren't told. We all live in Springfield, in some version of it, in some degree of it, and we all, in the middle of all of that, manage to love the people on our couch. The Simpsons is not a show about whether love is enough to overcome structural damage. It's fairly clear that in Springfield, it isn't. The structural damage continues regardless of how much Homer loves Marge or how much Marge loves her children. The plant keeps running, Burns keeps living, the water stays contaminated, but the show is also a show about whether love, in the context of structural damage, is worth having. And on that question, 36 years of Springfield has produced a consistent, unambiguous answer. It is. It always is. Even in a contamination zone, even in a company town, even in a loop that doesn't break, and a timeline that doesn't move, and a town that forgets by morning what was true at night, even there, even still. The family is on the couch. The couch gag plays. Springfield continues. And somehow, inexplicably, given everything we know about Springfield, given every theory and every buried truth and every structural horror that the town contains and has always contained, we are glad to be there with them. That's the final mystery. Not who shot Burns, not where Springfield is on a map, not why nobody ages, not how Burns stays alive. The final mystery is why we keep going back. And the answer, if you've spent any time at all on Evergreen Terrace, is probably obvious. Because they're home, the final question the show poses, the one underneath all the theories and all the mysteries and all the buried truths and the exposed wiring that 36 seasons of careful attention reveals, is not about Springfield's geography or its timeline or its toxicology. It's about us. We built this town. Not in the sense of authorship, though the writers and animators and producers built it in that sense. In the deeper sense, we needed this town. America in 1989 needed a place where it could watch itself be ridiculous and terrible and loving and damaged and resilient and funny and sad, all at the same time, without the cognitive cost of recognizing it as a mirror rather than a window. Springfield is a window we think we're looking through. It's a mirror we're looking into. The yellow faces are our faces. The four fingers are our hands. The nuclear plant that poisons the water is the thing we've agreed to live with because confronting it would require confronting what it's done to us. And what it's done to us is who we are now, and we're not sure we want to know that. The Simpsons is the most American text in the history of American popular culture, not because it's the most beloved or the most watched or the longest running, though it may be all of those things. It's the most American text because it contains in plain sight the full truth of the American condition, that we live in a system that was not designed with our welfare as its primary purpose, that we love each other genuinely and completely within that system, and that the love and the system coexist without one eliminating or fully redeeming the other. That's not a comfortable truth. That's not a truth that resolves into anything easy to hold. The Simpsons made it funny, and the comedy made it bearable, and the bearability is what kept us coming back, and the coming back is what made it the longest-running scripted primetime show in American history. We kept coming back because it was home, even knowing what was in the water, even seeing the cracked cooling towers, even watching the fish with 3 eyes swim through the river behind the house on Evergreen Terrace. Home anyway, despite everything. That's Springfield, that's the show. That's all of it, reduced to its simplest, truest form. Home anyway. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If these theories gave you something to turn over in your mind as you drift off, that's exactly what they were meant to do. Good night from Evergreen Terrace. The lights are on, the couch is waiting, the family is home. There is one last thing to say about Springfield, and it's the simplest thing, and it may be the most true. The show has been on the air for 36 years. It will probably continue for some number of years beyond this script's writing and this viewer's watching. And in all that time, across all of those episodes, through all of the theories and the buried truths and the structural horrors and the ecological damage and the institutional failures and the deals made in darkness and the truths expelled at the town line, one thing has never changed, has never been successfully challenged, has persisted with the same consistency as the yellow skin and the four fingers and the floating timeline. The family comes home. Homer comes home. Marge is there. The kids are there. The house on Evergreen Terrace has its lights on. And whatever happened in the episode, whatever impossibility was confronted or catastrophe survived or truth suppressed or disaster forgotten, the family is intact at the end of it. Not because the world is kind to them. The world of Springfield is demonstrably not kind to them. Because they are, despite everything, oriented toward each other. Homer, with his damaged brain and his enormous heart and his complete incapacity for strategic self-preservation, comes home because home is where Marge is. And Marge holds it because it's where her family is. And the family holds because love, even in a contamination zone, even in a company town, even in a loop that doesn't break, is apparently the one force Springfield's conditions have never quite managed to neutralize. That's the show. In the end, that's the whole show. And it's enough. Every theory in this video is, at its core, an act of attention. An act of refusing to look past the thing that the show has been showing you, quietly and consistently, for 36 years. The yellow skin, the four fingers, the fish, the forgetting, the plant. The man at the top who outlives everyone's expectations, and the man at the bottom who holds the whole structure together by being exactly insufficient enough to never fix it. Pay attention long enough and Springfield stops being a cartoon. It becomes a document. And the document, read carefully, tells you something true.